What's up, everybody? This is Jason, and you're listening to the Unsung Podcast. This is part 5 of American Guerrillas, an ongoing series covering the Kansas territorial period and the Kansas-Missouri border war. If you haven't heard the previous parts yet, I'd suggest you go back and listen to those first. If you've already heard those, or if you're just a barbarian who doesn't care about order, welcome. If you're still here after the 8-hour monstrosity that was part 4, thank you for sticking with it. Don't worry, this one is much shorter. I'll give my pitch for the Substack up front this time instead of waiting until the end. If you appreciate what I'm doing here, you can support me by subscribing there for $5 a month or $50 a year. As of the release of this episode, I already have a couple of paid subscribers, which is just awesome. I mean, this is a pretty new show, and it's not like I have a big backlog of episodes or a proven long-term track record or anything like that, so I take those paid subscriptions as a real vote of confidence. It's very motivating, and I really appreciate you guys. Also, as of now, there is a bonus episode of the podcast available on Substack for paid subscribers only. If you're listening to this on another podcast app, you won't be able to listen to that one in your main feed. You'll have to go over to Substack, link in the show notes, and become a paid subscriber, and then you'll be able to listen. It's not required listening for this series. Don't worry, it won't be on the test. It is a bonus episode after all and not part of the main series, but if you're interested in the topics I'm covering here, I think you'll find it interesting, and I wanted to get something out there to show a little appreciation to the paid subscribers. There's also PayPal and Venmo, which are linked in the show notes if you'd like to support me but don't want to sign up for a subscription. I appreciate those too, but that's not through Substack, so you won't get access to the paid-only bonus episode that way. That's about all I got, so thanks for joining me again. This is American Guerrillas, Part 5. Let's go.
Well, you're gonna pull those pistols or whistle Dixie? I get to liking someone, they ain't around long.
I notice when you get to disliking someone, they ain't around for long either.
Pretty sure we have time to bury them fellas.
Hell with them fellas. Buzzards gotta eat, same as worms.
His hollow laugh aroused the constant and unpleasant suggestion of a mind diseased. That is how New York Tribune correspondent Albert Richardson described James Montgomery after his 1858 interview with the already infamous Jayhawker. We touched on that idea in the last episode, but now I want to pull that thread a little further. Running throughout lots of ancient philosophy, you'll find this theme of a multi-leveled structure of human societies, and there are analogous relationships between the different levels. At the lowest level, you have the individual man. Then moving up from there, you have the household, the clan or kin group, the village, the city, and at the highest level, maybe a nation or even an empire. Maybe one of the best examples of drawing analogs or parallels between the different layers comes in Plato's Republic, which on its face is an exploration of what an ideal state would look like, but can also be understood as exploring an ideal individual soul. Aristotle explains in his Nicomachean Ethics what virtue is for an individual, or how an individual ought to act. His Politics is presented as a separate work, but as Aristotle tells us himself in the closing chapter of the Ethics, the Politics is really just a natural extension of the Ethics. As the Ethics describes what virtue is for an individual soul, the Politics describes it for a community or a state. You could also think of virtue as analogous to health. A virtuous soul is a healthy soul. A vicious soul is a diseased soul. Just as an individual soul or an individual mind, like Montgomery's, can be diseased, there is an analogous way in which a city or a nation can be diseased. And appropriately enough, there's a book on that very topic as it relates to the American Civil War. It's by historian Thomas Fleming, and it's called A Disease in the Public Mind, A New Understanding of Why We Fought the Civil War. I'll read the preface of this book for you, and after I do, I think it'll make sense why I bring it up now. Quote, "The Civil War freed almost 4 million Americans from the humiliations and oppressions of slavery. It is undoubtedly one of America's greatest triumphs. As we celebrate the 150th anniversary of this huge event, however, we must also grieve. The Civil War is simultaneously America's greatest tragedy. No other conflict in the nation's 237-year history can compare to the anguish and grief it inflicted on the men and women who were engulfed by it. For almost a century, the accepted figure for the number of soldiers killed in the war was 618,222. Recently, an historian who has restudied the census records of 1870 and 1880 has concluded that the toll was at least 750,000. There's a strong possibility that the correct number is 850,000. The Southern Confederacy's records vanished with their defeat. Their toll is only an estimate. If we include the wounded men who died prematurely over the next 2 decades, the toll for both sides may be 1 million. This much is certain. More soldiers died in that 4-year struggle than the nation lost in all her previous and future wars combined." Breaking in myself here for a second. Yes, you heard that right. Even when you include both world wars and Korea and Vietnam and every war the United States has ever fought, add up all the American deaths in all those wars, and they still don't equal the number of dead in our own Civil War. And that's not even counting civilian deaths, which were at least another 50 to 100,000 on top of the military deaths. Think of an entire Vietnam War's worth of civilians dead as a direct result of the Civil War. This is the scale we're talking about. Continuing with Fleming. What makes these numbers especially horrendous is the fact that America's population in 1861 was about 31 million. In 2012, U.S. population is about 313 million. If a similar conflict demanded the same sacrifice from our young men and women today, the number of dead might total over 10 million. Think for a moment about how many stricken parents, wives, fiancés, and children would be struggling to cope with this tidal wave of grief and loss. The enormity of the Civil War's tragedy grows even larger when we realize that the United States is the only country in the world that fought such a horrific war to end slavery. Other nations with large slave populations, such as Great Britain, which had 850,000 slaves in its West Indies islands, Cuba, which had almost 1 million, and Brazil, which had at least 3 million, ended the deplorable institution with relatively little bloodshed. Even Tsarist Russia, with its millions of semi-slaves known as serfs, freed them without a war. Why were the Americans, with a government designed to respond to the voice, or voices, of the people, compelled to resort to such awful carnage? The question becomes even more perplexing when we consider another startling fact. Only 316,632 Southerners owned slaves. A mere 6% of the total white population of 5,582,322. These figures become doubly baffling when a further analysis reveals only 46,274 of these masters owned 50 or more slaves, entitling them to the aristocratic-sounding term planter. Why did the vast majority of the white population unite behind these slaveholders in this fratricidal war? Why did they sacrifice over 300,000 of their sons to preserve an institution in which they apparently had no personal stake? I have devoted much of my literary life to writing about the American Revolution. My exploration of our founding years convinced me of the originality and importance of the heritage created by the men and women who won an 8-year struggle against the most powerful nation in the world and created the modern era's first republic. Ironically, this conviction made me even more baffled by the Civil War's eruption little more than a half-century after George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and their compatriots turned the leadership of the new nation over to the next generation. I never thought I would do more than muse about the Civil War until my good friend Byron Hollinshead, director of American Historical Publications and former publisher of 2 distinguished history magazines, asked me to contribute to a book entitled I Wish I'd Been There. A gallery of well-known historians was asked to insert themselves into famous events of the past and describe them as if they were on the scene. I became a spectator/actor in John Brown's 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry. I was mesmerized, not only by the chief protagonist, but by the reactions of prominent contemporaries, ranging from Robert E. Lee to Abraham Lincoln to Ralph Waldo Emerson. Especially fascinating was the statement of the President of the United States in 1859, James Buchanan. Brown's reckless venture was caused, Buchanan said, by an incurable disease in the public mind. In his final message to Congress in 1860, as Southern states seceded and the Civil War loomed, he repeated the assertion. Buchanan's frequently hostile biographers have all dismissed or ignored these words. They caught my attention because in 2 of my previous books I have explored how illusions play a role in history. Was the president talking about this sort of distortion? Few presidents have lower ratings than Mr. Buchanan in the polls historians take to rank the nation's chief executives as great, near great, mediocre, or failures. On the other hand, not many presidents had more experience in national politics than Old Buck. He spent almost 40 years as a congressman and senator, plus terms as Secretary of State and ambassador to Great Britain before winning the White House. I soon discovered that President Buchanan did not originate the phrase public mind. Thomas Jefferson frequently used the term to describe various aspects of the politics of his era. Writing to George Washington in 1792 about the angry disagreements stirred by the new federal government's financial policy, Jefferson warned, "The public mind is no longer confident and serene." Abraham Lincoln was another man who frequently invoked the phrase. In 1861, he accused the South of debauching the public mind about the right to secede. A century later, Democratic presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson declared, "Those who corrupt the public mind are just as evil as those who steal from the public purse." The public mind is intimately linked with public opinion, which one early 19th century commentator called that inexorable judge of men and manners in a republic. But the public mind suggests something less fluctuating than opinion, and more complex than an illusion, which can be swiftly dispelled by events. The phrase implies fixed beliefs that are fundamental to the way people participate in the world of their time. A disease in the public mind would seem to be a twisted interpretation of political or economic or spiritual realities that seizes control of thousands and even millions of minds. Americans first experienced one of these episodes in 1692, when the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony became convinced that witches were threatening their society with evil powers. Over 200 people were arrested and flung into fetid jails. 21 were hanged. One 71-year-old man was pressed to death beneath heavy stones, and at least 7 died in prison. No one has described this public frenzy better than the New England novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne. Now he quotes Hawthorne. "That terrible delusion should teach us, among its other morals, that the influential classes are fully liable to all the passionate error that has ever characterized the maddest mob. Clergymen, judges, statesmen, the wisest, calmest, holiest persons of their day, stood in the inner circle round about the gallows, loudest to acclaim the work of blood, latest to confess themselves miserably deceived." Back to Fleming. A similar frenzy seized the nation in the closing decades of the 19th century, reaching a climax on January 16, 1919, when Congress passed the 18th Amendment, banning the sale and consumption of alcoholic drinks. Prohibition destroyed the liquor industry, the 7th largest business in the United States. Tens of thousands of people lost their jobs. For the next 13 years, the ban corrupted and tormented Americans from coast to coast. Rather than discouraging liquor consumption, prohibition increased it. Taking a drink became a sign of defiance against the arrogant minority who had deprived people of their right to enjoy themselves. The 1920s roared with reckless amorality in all directions, including Wall Street. When everything came crashing down in 1929 and the gray years of the Great Depression began, second thoughts were the order of the day. Large numbers of people pointed to the state of mind inspired by Prohibition as one of the chief reasons for the disaster. In 1933, a new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, made the repeal of the 18th Amendment one of his priorities. But the evil effects of the plunge into moral redemption linger to this day, most notably in the influence of organized crime, better known as the Mafia, in many areas of American life. The experience proved that a passionate minority, seized by the noble desire to achieve some great moral goal, may be abysmally wrong. Later in the 20th century, a European disease of the public mind consumed a horrific number of lives. Communism, with its spurious goal of achieving economic equality, killed an estimated 50 million people in Soviet Russia alone, and uncounted millions more elsewhere. In America, an offshoot of this disease, McCarthyism, roiled our politics and morality for most of a decade after World War II. Spawned by Joseph McCarthy, a junior senator from Wisconsin, McCarthyism prompted thousands of Americans to become enraged investigators and persecutors of their fellow Americans, based on the often spurious accusation that they were or once had been communist or communist sympathizers. Many saw their legal, literary, film, or other careers ruined. Some people, driven to despair, committed suicide. A good example was my friend, novelist Howard Fast, who was forced to write under a pseudonym to make a living. I was among several fellow writers who gave him quotes that his publisher used to help sell these secretly written books. Analyzing these false beliefs gave me additional insights into how a disease in the public mind works its dark will in the world. It is backed by politicians and other prominent leaders, and often by a media apparatus. Newspapers, pamphlets, books, magazine articles, and in the 20th century, television, radio, and film that reinforces the disease with massive repetition. At least as important are hate-filled verbal denunciations of real or supposed opponents. On September 11, 2001, the United States awoke from the illusion that an era of peace and reason was dawning after the collapse of Soviet communism in 1989. Muslim fanatics flew 2 passenger planes into the Twin Towers of New York's World Trade Center, and another plane into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., killing themselves and 2,700 Americans. The disease in the public mind that motivated these true believers was a warped version of the Mohammedan faith. Perhaps President Buchanan's assertion that a disease in the public mind produced John Brown in 1859 and the ensuing Civil War deserves consideration, at the very least. Let us remember it while we visit a blood-stained Harper's Ferry and begin our journey into the history that inflamed John Brown's already unbalanced brain, the United States of America's entanglement with African slavery. End quote. This book fits pretty nicely into this point in my narrative because as his entry point into the larger topic of diseases of the public mind, Fleming chooses John Brown and his raid on Harper's Ferry. The prologue of his book briefly narrates the raid and points out some of the, let's say, inconsistencies apparent between Brown's actions, his stated plans and goals, and the public perception of his actions. It's a natural jumping-off point for us to look at the raid, the trial, the fallout from both, and how these things led into the horror that's coming. And as much as I don't want to talk about John Brown anymore, these things are important to understand. We've already been over the narrative of the raid in Part 4, so I won't retell the whole thing here, but I will show you some of the things Fleming points out that don't really add up. First, let's remember what the stated plan was for Brown. Fleming writes, quote, Sunday, October 16, 1859, was a day of clouds and light rain in the rolling farm country of western Maryland. In a dilapidated 2-story house rented from a man named Kennedy, 21 men, 5 of them black, attended a religious service led by 59-year-old John Brown. Fiercely erect, with glaring blue eyes and a gaunt face, largely concealed by a long gray beard, Brown urged them to ask God's blessing on the insurrection they were about to launch with their attack on the federal arsenal in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Brown confidently predicted that the arsenal's 20,000 rifles and millions of rounds of ammunition would equip a conquering army of slaves from Maryland and Virginia and anti-slavery whites from nearby Pennsylvania. They would all flock to the cause when they heard the electrifying news that weapons of liberation were waiting for them. With Jehovah's help, they were certain to achieve their awesome goal, nothing less than freeing the South's 4 million slaves. Brown and his followers had spent the summer at the farmhouse, slowly accumulating weapons and ammunition. In their barn, they now had 198 Sharps rifles, 200 Maynard revolvers, and 980 menacing pikes. The Sharps rifles were expensive, highly accurate guns, capable of firing 8 to 10 shots a minute. The 6-shot Maynard revolvers were reserved for officers in their prospective army. The pikes, 2-edged bowie knives attached to 6-foot poles, were intended for the freed slaves, whom Brown assumed would have trouble mastering the intricacies of loading and firing a gun. Some people, then and now, might wince at the idea of encouraging slaves to plunge these grisly weapons into the bodies of white Southerners. But John Brown was a man who did not flinch from shocking acts on behalf of his cause. The Connecticut-born visionary believed that slavery was an abominable crime, punishable by death, a conviction he had already demonstrated more than once. Among his favorite aphorisms was, "Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin." End quote. Now, I've brought up this idea of abolishing slavery through human sacrifice before, and John Brown was clearly a proponent of that, but he actually wasn't that much of an exception in that respect. It's actually shocking how common this view is in the abolitionist movement, in everybody from Brown to the Secret Six to other major clergymen and media figures. The anomalous thing about Brown was that he was more willing to put his own life on the line for this idea than just about anyone else. But the proponents of this idea as a group are exceptional in another sense. And this view of theirs is, again, a consequence of the breakdown in theology that has permeated the Western world since the 11th century and even before. Orthodox Christianity also believes in sacrifice for the remission of sins, but we believe the blood sacrifice has already been done. Christ was the perfect, willing sacrifice, which is represented in the liturgy every Sunday in the rational and bloodless sacrifice of the Eucharist. We don't sacrifice animals anymore, and we certainly don't sacrifice human beings, especially not unwilling ones. But that's exactly what Brown means when he talks about shedding blood to end slavery. He's not just talking about himself, he's talking about countless thousands of white Southerners, and probably Northerners too, millions of them if necessary, none of whom asked to be sacrificed on the altar of Brown's crusade. All this is what makes him and others like him exceptional, because, to be clear, while I do think these people's theology is a result of Protestantism run amok, they are still very much on the fringe, even as Protestants go. Protestants on the whole, and Catholics too for that matter, share the belief in Christ's once-and-for-all perfect sacrifice with the Orthodox, even if they have some doctrinal differences surrounding that. I mean, you don't see Protestants or Catholics sacrificing animals today either. But Brown, as well as Higginson, Parker, and many others, were explicitly tying the shedding of human blood to the end of slavery long before the war started. What this is a primitive belief in the sense that it's a reversion to a pre-Christian view of what sacrifice is and how it works. It completely ignores the universe-changing importance of Christ's incarnation, death, and resurrection. And for that reason, Brown and the others who share this view might call themselves Christians, but they can't be said to actually be Christians in any real sense. Spiritually, they're basically reverts to something like ancient paganism with extra steps. Fleming continues, quote, In the hot days of July and August, the volunteers had pondered maps of southern states that John Brown had drawn on cambric. Each was filled with numbers he had gleaned from the census of 1850, identifying counties where slaves outnumbered whites, sometimes by ratios of 6 or 7 to 1. With the blacks he expected to muster an arm in Virginia and Maryland, Brown planned to focus on these counties, triggering a series of slave revolts that would demoralize and slaughter slave owners and their supporters, from the Mason-Dixon line to the Gulf of Mexico. If white Southerners counterattacked, Brown planned to retreat into the Allegheny Mountains, where he and his followers would establish maroon communities, similar to the ones that escaped slaves had created in the mountains of Jamaica and Haiti. Skipping a little further down. Along with weapons, Brown brought 2 documents he considered of surpassing importance. The first was a Declaration of Independence by the representatives of the slave population of the United States of America. The Declaration denounced slaveholders as pirates, thieves, robbers, libertines, woman-killers, and barbarians. Politicians who tolerated this inhumanity were termed leeches, unworthy of being called half-civilized men. At least as important was a lengthier document, a provisional constitution and ordinances for the people of the United States. The Constitution's 48 articles began by emphasizing that citizenship and participation in the government were guaranteed to all persons of a mature age, without respect to race or sex. Another article specified that all persons of good character shall be encouraged to carry arms openly. Other clauses guaranteed protection to slaveholders who freed their slaves voluntarily and declared that the commander-in-chief, Brown, owned all goods and wealth confiscated from the enemy. Toward the close, consistency and order vanished. Brown had written the Constitution in a near frenzy, working day and night. These documents revealed John Brown's vision of an America in which blacks and whites would live as equals. It was an extraordinary ideal for a white American in 1859, when the vast majority of the nation, North and South, regarded blacks as inferior and potentially dangerous. The presence of 5 black men in his volunteer army, living in intimate proximity with his white soldiers, proved Brown meant what he had written. The scrawled, almost illegible pages of the Declaration and Constitution also offer significant clues to John Brown's personality. A psychologist who made a careful study of Brown's life concluded that their extravagant phrases and frequent confusion were part of a pattern that coruscated through his career. Again and again, Brown had nurtured grandiose schemes and dreams that invariably ended in disappointment. The psychologist concluded that Brown was a manic depressive. In his manic phases, he was capable of going for days without sleep and producing magnificent plans that were ruinously short on practical details. End quote. The psychologist he's talking about there is named Kenneth A. Carroll, and in an endnote, Fleming quotes him as having said, quote, "The manic's enthusiasm for his project does not issue from careful, logical thought, but is a product of his emotional illness that intoxicates the subject with a grandiose and unshakable faith in the supreme importance of himself." Then Fleming continues, Carroll cites affidavits from Brown's neighbors in Ohio, where he grew up, full of recollections of Brown's manic behavior. Back to Carroll again. "The evidence that he was mentally ill is clear and abundant." End quote. Now, I probably don't need to tell you that I'm no psychologist. I'm not qualified to diagnose anyone, or to question a diagnosis for that matter. But I do tend to question the usefulness of a diagnosis like this anyway. You could bring up potential problems of diagnosing a guy with a mental illness from his life and writings alone without ever having talked to him. But let's leave that aside, give Carroll the benefit of the doubt that he knows what he's talking about and his assessment is accurate. What have we actually gotten from that? We have a label called manic depression, but notice that label doesn't actually explain anything. All it does is give us a name for the pattern of behavior observed in Brown's life. It says nothing about why he was this way. There's no explanatory power to it. It's like asking, why are the Chiefs the best team in the NFL? And answering, because they're good at football. It's almost a tautology. You have to dig deeper if you want an actual explanation for the behavior. As a Christian, I would go to religion as an explanation. I would point to the corruption of the soul brought about as a result of Brown's pseudo-pagan religious beliefs. To be fair to Fleming, this isn't his conclusion, it's just a starting point for his examination of Brown. And the idea that Brown might have suffered from some diagnosable mental illness ties him into this larger idea of a disease in the public mind that Fleming is driving at. Now we'll get into some parts of the plan that don't make any sense. Fleming continues, quote, "In his manic confidence in his plan, John Brown ignored aspects of the ferry that suggested it was a good deal less than an ideal place from which to launch an insurrection. Huge cliffs towered over the town. Any military force in control of those heights could make raiders in the streets or buildings of Harper's Ferry extremely uncomfortable. Another problem was the town's proximity to major population centers. It was little more than 60 miles from Baltimore and Washington, D.C., with major highways running to both cities. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's main line also ran through the town. These realities made it unlikely that Brown would have much time to spread the word of his insurrection to the eastern parts of Virginia and Maryland, where slaves were far more numerous, before whites organized serious opposition. Around Harper's Ferry, there were few large farms worked by gangs of field hands. Almost all the area's slaves were house servants. Brown's first order, as they approached the ferry, was to cut the telegraph lines. The strangeness, one might even say folly, of this command would become apparent in the next few hours." End quote. We'll come back to that in a minute. Next, Fleming goes over the arrival of the train bound for Baltimore and the death of the free black baggage master Hayward Shepherd. He says that in Harper's Ferry itself there were 1,251 free blacks at that time and only 88 slaves, meaning that in all Brown's time marking up maps with population data to find areas where slaves outnumbered whites, he apparently ignored all that in choosing Harper's Ferry as his first target. He continues a little further on, quote, "In the armory, John Brown did little or nothing in a military way except strap on George Washington's sword. About 3 a.m., he walked out on the bridge and told the train's conductor it could proceed. Brown knew the train would stop at the next town on the line, Monocacy, Maryland, and telegraphed the news of his incursion. This decision made no sense in the light of Brown's previous order to cut the telegraph lines. Apparently, only now had it dawned on him that he needed help in spreading the news of his insurrection. He apparently did not realize that the news would also arouse white opposition throughout Maryland and Virginia. Around 5 a.m., Brown sent 3 men and 2 freed slaves armed with pikes back to the Kennedy farm, with orders to shift the rifles, revolvers, and remaining pikes to a log schoolhouse on the Maryland side of the Potomac River. This decision also made little sense. There was no sign of an outpouring of support from the area's slaves to use these weapons. Brown compounded this folly by telling his son Owen that everything at Harper's Ferry was going well. Rain continued to drool from the dawn-gray sky. When the employees of the armory showed up for work, apparently unwarned by the fugitives on the heights, Brown added them to his bag of hostages. He ordered 45 breakfasts on credit from the town's hotel, the Wager House. Brown ostentatiously refused to eat any of the food, declaring it might be poisoned, but he permitted his sons and the rest of his army to consume it. Aside from evidence of Brown's growing incoherence, the breakfast order revealed that this far-seeing military commander had led his men to war without bothering to provide them with a morsel of food. By now it was also evident that Brown had made no discernible plans to feed the hundreds, perhaps thousands, of slaves he hoped to maintain in his mountain strongholds. He had also wasted the hours of the night without making the slightest attempt to transfer any of the arsenal's 20,000 rifles beyond the precincts of Harper's Ferry to arm the slaves. Nor had he displayed the slightest interest in spreading the news of his declaration of slave independence and his constitution for an equal rights republic." End quote. As the raid progressed and Brown and his men were besieged inside the armory's engine house, Brown continued to show this absurd delusion of himself as some kind of legitimate military commander who thought himself in a position to negotiate some kind of surrender terms. He showed an almost inhuman callousness to his own sons Watson and Oliver as they lay bleeding to death of gunshot wounds. Fleming continues, quote, "Inside the firehouse, Watson and Oliver Brown were dying in awful pain. Oliver asked his father to kill him to end his agony. 'You'll get over it,' Brown snarled. When Oliver's cries continued, Brown snapped, 'If you must die, die like a man.' When the boy's sobs and moans finally ceased, Brown called, 'Oliver.' There was no answer. 'I guess he's dead,' Brown said, without a trace of emotion in his voice. While his sons died, Brown made speeches to his hostages. 'Gentlemen,' he said, 'if you knew of my past history, you would not blame me for being here. I went to Kansas a peaceable man, and the pro-slavery people hunted me down like a wolf.' This was neither the first nor the last of John Brown's many lies. One of the hostages asked Brown if he was aware that he had committed treason by attacking a federal arsenal. 'Certainly,' Brown said. Two of the raiders, a brother of the dead Thompson and a young man named Anderson from Indiana, exclaimed in shock at Brown's admission. They announced that they would fight no more. They had joined Brown to free slaves, not commit treason. It was a sad glimpse of the simplicity of Brown's followers." End quote. On the subject of Brown's followers, remember, most of these guys were in their early to mid-20s at the oldest, while Brown himself was 59, in the position of a father figure to them, besides being the literal father of three of them. Fleming continues after the assault on the engine house, in which Brown was beaten severely by Lieutenant Green but survived. Quote, "Back in the firehouse, Brown was bleeding profusely from wounds to the head. They were all superficial. While they were being dressed, he regained consciousness. Marines carried him into the Armory Paymaster's office, where he lay on a pallet while dozens of curious ferry townsfolk ogled him. In the afternoon, Virginia's governor, Henry A. Wise, and several other politicians, including Senator James M. Mason of Virginia and Congressman Clement Vallandigham of Ohio, arrived to question him. Reporters mingled with these visitors. Colonel Lee asked Brown if he wished the newsmen excluded. Brown said he wanted them to stay. He was eager to make himself and his motives clearly understood. Brown swiftly demonstrated his goal was obfuscation, not clarity. He did his utmost to conceal the identity of his northern backers. He also tried to muddle the scope of his insurrection. He told Senator Mason, "We came to free the slaves, and only that." Congressman Vallandigham asked him if he had been hoping for a general rising of the slaves. "No, sir," Brown lied. "I expected to gather them up from time to time and set them free." End quote. Now, Fleming quotes a couple other things from this interview, but I'm just going to read the whole thing for you. It was recorded by a reporter on the scene, and it's freely available at a lot of places online, so you can go read it for yourself too if you want. And as I read this, keep in mind the details of everything we've talked about connected to this raid, and also Brown's time in Kansas. Because while he might portray this image of himself as this simple, honest, unapologetic zealot, he's lying through his teeth for this entire interview. The other thing I want you to ponder as I read this is the following question. At what point in all of this did John Brown become conscious of his coming martyrdom? I think it's very clear, judging from his behavior at his execution, that he was certainly conscious of it by then. I'll suggest that at the time of this interview, he was already conscious of what was coming for him, and furthermore, he knew this interview was being recorded. In fact, he specifically told Lee that he wanted the reporters to stay in the room. I think at this point, he was already consciously playing the part of the heroic Puritan martyr for abolition for the American public that he knew would hear about this interview very soon. So anyway, here's the interview. This was on October 18th, 1859. Senator Mason: "Can you tell us who furnished money for your expedition?" John Brown: "I furnished most of it myself. I cannot implicate others. It is by my own folly that I have been taken. I could easily have saved myself from it, had I exercised my own better judgment rather than yielded to my feelings." Mason: "You mean if you had escaped immediately?" Brown: No, I had the means to make myself secure without any escape, but I allowed myself to be surrounded by a force by being too tardy. I should have gone away, but I had 30-odd prisoners whose wives and daughters were in tears for their safety, and I felt for them. Besides, I wanted to allay the fears of those who believed we came here to burn and kill. For this reason I allowed the train to cross the bridge and gave them full liberty to pass on. I did it only to spare the feelings of those passengers and their families, and to allay the apprehensions that you had got here in your vicinity a band of men who had no regard for life and property, nor any feelings of humanity. Mason. But you killed some people passing along the streets quietly. Brown. Well, sir, if there was anything of that kind done, it was without my knowledge. Your own citizens who were my prisoners will tell you that every possible means was taken to prevent it. I did not allow my men to fire when there was danger of killing those we regarded as innocent persons if I could help it. They will tell you that we allowed ourselves to be fired at repeatedly and did not return it. A bystander. That is not so. You killed an unarmed man at the corner of the house over there at the water tank, and another besides. Brown. See here, my friend, it is useless to dispute or contradict the report of your own neighbors who were my prisoners. Mason. If you would tell us who sent you here, who provided the means, that would be information of some value. Brown. I will answer freely and faithfully about what concerns myself. I will answer anything I can with honor, but not about others. Mr. Vallandigham. Mr. Brown, who sent you here? Brown. No man sent me here. It was my own prompting and that of my Maker, or that of the devil, whichever you please to ascribe it to. I acknowledge no master in human form. Vallandigham. Did you get up the expedition yourself? Brown. I did. Vallandigham. Did you get up this document that is called a constitution? Brown. I did. They are a constitution and ordinances of my own contriving and getting up. Vallandigham. How long have you been engaged in this business? Brown. From the breaking out of the difficulties in Kansas. 4 of my sons had gone there to settle, but because of the difficulties. Mason. How many are there engaged with you in this movement? Brown. Any questions that I can honorably answer I will, not otherwise. So far as I am myself concerned, I have told everything truthfully. I value my word, sir. Mason. What was your object in coming? Brown. We came to free the slaves, and only that. A volunteer. How many men in all had you? Brown. I came to Virginia with 18 men only, besides myself. Volunteer. What in the world did you suppose you could do here in Virginia with that amount of men? Brown. Young man, I do not wish to discuss that question here. Volunteer. You could not do anything. Brown. Well, perhaps your ideas and mine on military subjects would differ materially. Mason. How do you justify your acts? Brown. I think, my friend, that you are guilty of a great wrong against God and humanity. I say it without wishing to be offensive, and it would be perfectly right for anyone to interfere with you so far as to free those you willfully and wickedly hold in bondage. I do not say this insultingly. Mason. I understand that. Brown. I think I did right, and that others will do right who interfere with you at any time and at all times. I hold that the golden rule, do unto others as ye would that others should do unto you, applies to all who would help others gain their liberty. Lieutenant Stewart. But don't you believe in the Bible? Brown. Certainly I do. Mason. Did you consider this a military organization in this Constitution? I have not yet read it. Brown. I did, in some sense. I wish you would give that paper close attention. Mason. You consider yourself the commander-in-chief of these provisional military forces? Brown. I was chosen, agreeably to the ordinance of a certain document, commander-in-chief of that force. Mason. What wages did you offer? Brown. None. Stewart. The wages of sin is death. Brown. I would not have made such a remark to you if you had been a prisoner and wounded in my hands. A bystander. Did you not promise a Negro in Gettysburg $20 a month? Brown. I did not. Mason. Does this talking annoy you? Brown. Not in the least. Vallandigham. Have you lived long in Ohio? Brown. I went there in 1805. I lived in Summit County, which was then Portage County. My native place is Connecticut. My father lived there till 1805. Vallandigham. Have you been in Portage County lately? Brown. I was there in June last. Vallandigham. When in Cleveland, did you attend the Fugitive Slave Law Convention there? Brown. No, I was there about the time of the sitting of the court to try the Oberlin rescuers. I spoke there publicly on that subject, on the fugitive slave law and my own rescue. Of course, so far as I had any influence at all, I was supposed to justify the Oberlin people for rescuing a slave, because I have myself forcibly taken slaves from bondage. I was concerned in taking 11 slaves from Missouri to Canada last winter. I think I spoke in Cleveland before the convention. I do not know that I had conversation with any of the Oberlin rescuers. I was sick part of the time I was in Ohio with the ague in Ashtabula County. Vallandigham. Did you see anything of Joshua R. Giddings there? Brown. I did meet him. Vallandigham. Did you converse with him? Brown. I did. I would not tell you, of course, anything that would implicate Mr. Giddings, but I certainly met with him and had conversations with him. Vallandigham. About that rescue case? Brown. Yes, I heard him express his opinions upon it very freely and frankly. Vallandigham. Justifying it? Brown. Yes, sir. I do not compromise him, certainly, in saying that. Vallandigham. Will you answer this? Did you talk with Giddings about your expedition here? Brown. No, I won't answer that, because a denial of it would not make, and to make any affirmation of it I should be a great dunce. Vallandigham. Have you had correspondence with parties at the North on the subject of this movement? Brown. I have had correspondence. A bystander. Do you consider this a religious movement? Brown. It is, in my opinion, the greatest service man can render to God. Bystander. Do you consider yourself an instrument in the hands of Providence? Brown. I do. Bystander. Upon what principle do you justify your acts? Brown. Upon the golden rule. I pity the poor in bondage that have none to help them. That is why I am here, not to gratify any personal animosity, revenge, or vindictive spirit. It is my sympathy with the oppressed and the wronged that are as good as you and as precious in the sight of God. Bystander. Certainly, but why take the slaves against their will? Brown. I never did. Bystander. You did in one instance at least. Aaron Stevens. You are right. In one case, I knew the Negro wanted to go back. Remember, Stevens was the man shot 6 times while trying to parley under a flag of truce. Bystander. Where did you come from? Stevens. I lived in Ashtabula County, Ohio. Vallandigham. How recently did you leave Ashtabula County? Stevens. Some months ago. I never resided there any length of time. Have been through there. Vallandigham. How far did you live from Jefferson? Brown. Be cautious, Stevens, about any answers that would commit any friend. I would not answer that. Stevens turned partially over with a groan of pain and was silent. Vallandigham. Who are your advisers in this movement? Brown: I cannot answer that. I have numerous sympathizers throughout the entire North. Vallandigham: In northern Ohio? Brown: No more than anywhere else, in all the free states. Vallandigham: But you are not personally acquainted in southern Ohio. Brown: Not very much. A bystander: Did you ever live in Washington City? Brown: I did not. I want you to understand, gentlemen, and you may report that, I want you to understand that I respect the rights of the poorest and weakest of colored people oppressed by the slave system just as much as I do those of the most wealthy and powerful. This is the idea that has moved me, and that alone. We expected no reward except the satisfaction of endeavoring to do for those in distress and greatly oppressed as we would be done by. The cry of distress of the oppressed is my reason, and the only thing that prompted me to come here. Bystander: Why did you do it secretly? Brown: Because I thought that necessary to success. No other reason. Bystander: Have you ever read Gerrit Smith's last letter? Brown: What letter do you mean? Bystander: The New York Herald of yesterday, in speaking of this affair, mentions a letter in this way. Apropos of this exciting news, we recollect a very significant passage in one of Gerrit Smith's letters, published a month or two ago, in which he speaks of the folly of attempting to strike the shackles off the slaves by the force of moral suasion or legal agitation, and predicts that the next movement made in the direction of Negro emancipation would be an insurrection in the South. Brown: I have not seen the New York Herald for some days past, but I presume that your remark about the gist of the letter, that I should concur with it. I agree with Mr. Smith that moral suasion is hopeless. I don't think the people of the slave states will ever consider the subject of slavery in its true light till some other argument is resorted to than moral suasion. Vallandigham: Did you expect a general rising of the slaves in case of your success? Brown: No, sir, nor did I wish it. I expected to gather them up from time to time and set them free. Vallandigham: Did you expect to hold possession here till then? Brown: Well, probably I had quite a different idea. I do not know that I ought to reveal my plans. I am here a prisoner and wounded because I foolishly allowed myself to be so. You overrate your strength in supposing I could have been taken if I had not allowed it. I was too tardy after commencing the open attack, in delaying my movements through Monday night and up to the time I was attacked by the government troops. It was all occasioned by my desire to spare the feelings of my prisoners and their families and the community at large. I had no knowledge of the shooting of the Negro Haywood. He means Hayward Shepherd. Vallandigham: What time did you commence your organization in Canada? Brown: That occurred about 2 years ago, in 1858. Vallandigham: Who was the secretary? Brown: That I would not tell if I recollected, but I do not recollect. I think the officers were elected in May 1858. I may answer incorrectly, but not intentionally. My head is a little confused by wounds and my memory obscure on dates, etc. Dr. Biggs: Were you in the party at Dr. Kennedy's house? Brown: I was at the head of that party. I occupied the house to mature my plan. I have not been in Baltimore to purchase caps. Dr. Biggs: What was the number of men at Kennedy's? Brown: I decline to answer that. Dr. Biggs: Who lanced that woman's neck on the hill? Brown: I did. I have sometimes practiced in surgery when I thought it a matter of humanity and necessity, and there was no one else to do it, but I have not studied surgery. Dr. Biggs: It was done very well and scientifically. They have been very clever to the neighbors, I have been told, and we had not reason to suspect them, except that we could not understand their movements. They were represented as 8 or 9 persons. On Friday there were 13. Brown: There were more than that. Dr. Biggs: Where did you get arms? Brown: I bought them. Dr. Biggs: In what state? Brown. That I will not state. Dr. Biggs. How many guns? Brown. 200 Sharps rifles and 200 revolvers, a little under Navy size. Dr. Biggs. Why did you not take that swivel you left in the house? Brown. I had no occasion for it. It was given me a year or two ago. Dr. Biggs. In Kansas? Brown. No, I had nothing given to me in Kansas. Dr. Biggs. By whom, and in what state? Brown. I decline to answer. It is not properly a swivel. It is a very large rifle with a pivot. The ball is larger than a musket ball. It is intended for a slug. Reporter. I do not wish to annoy you, but if you have anything further you would like to say, I will report it. Brown. I have nothing to say, only that I claim to be here in carrying out a measure I believe perfectly justifiable, and not to act the part of an incendiary or ruffian, but to aid those suffering a great wrong. I wish to say furthermore that you had better, all you people at the South, prepare yourselves for a settlement of this question, that must come up for settlement sooner than you are prepared for it. The sooner you are prepared, the better. You may dispose of me very easily. I am nearly disposed of now, but this question is still to be settled. This Negro question, I mean. The end of that is not yet. These wounds were inflicted upon me, both saber cuts on my head and bayonet stabs in different parts of my body, some minutes after I had ceased fighting and had consented to surrender, for the benefit of others, not for my own. I believe the Major would not have been alive. I could have killed him just as easily as a mosquito when he came in, but I supposed he only came in to receive our surrender. There had been loud and long calls of surrender from us, as loud as men could yell, but in the confusion and excitement I suppose we were not heard. I do not think the Major or anyone meant to butcher us after we had surrendered. An officer. Why did you not surrender before the attack? Brown. I did not think it was my duty or interest to do so. We assured the prisoners that we did not wish to harm them, and they should be set at liberty. I exercised my best judgment, not believing the people would wantonly sacrifice their own fellow citizens when we offered to let them go on condition of being allowed to change our position about a quarter of a mile. The prisoners agreed by a vote among themselves to pass across the bridge with us. We wanted them only as a sort of guarantee of our safety, that we should not be fired into. We took them, in the first place, as hostages and to keep them from doing any harm. We did kill some men in defending ourselves, but I saw no one fire except directly in self-defense. Our orders were strict not to harm anyone not in arms against us. Officer. Brown, suppose you had every nigger in the United States. What would you do with them? Brown. Set them free. Officer. Your intention was to carry them off and free them? Brown. Not at all. A bystander. To set them free would sacrifice the life of every man in this community. Brown. I do not think so. Bystander. I know it. I think you are fanatical. Brown. And I think you are fanatical. Whom the gods would destroy they first make mad, and you are mad. Bystander. Was it your only object to free the Negroes? Brown. Absolutely our only object. Bystander. But you demanded and took Colonel Washington's silver and watch. Brown. Yes, we intended freely to appropriate the property of the slaveholders to carry out our object. It was for that, and only that, and with no design to enrich ourselves with any plunder whatever. Bystander. Did you know Sherrod in Kansas? I understand you killed him. Brown. I killed no man except in fair fight. I fought at Blackjack Point and at Osawatomie, and if I killed anybody, it was at one of those places. Governor Wise. Mr. Brown, the silver of your hair is reddened by the blood of crime, and it is meet that you should eschew those hard illusions and think upon eternity. Brown. Governor, I have, from all appearances, not more than 15 or 20 years the start of you in the journey to that eternity of which you kindly warn me. And whether my tenure here shall be 15 months or 15 days or 15 hours, I am equally prepared to go. There is an eternity behind and an eternity before, and the little speck in the center, however long, is but comparatively a minute. The difference between your tenure and mine is trifling, and I want to therefore tell you to be prepared. I am prepared. You all have a heavy responsibility, and it behooves you to prepare more than it does me." End quote. This is just my reading of these events, so, take it with a grain of salt. But it seems to me that this whole operation was meant to be John Brown's martyrdom from the beginning. Think about all these seemingly nonsensical decisions. Brown's choice of target, his complete disregard for Frederick Douglass's warnings, his complete disregard for any logistics at all, including the provision of food for his men and for any slaves he might free, his lack of any attempt to remove weapons from the armory or free any significant numbers of slaves. All of that instantly makes infinitely more sense if you just assume that Brown went into the raid expecting and intending to die in the attempt, and that the purpose of the whole thing was for him to give meaning to his fairly unremarkable and sad life up to that point. Throw in the fact that the year before, in 1858, he'd said in a letter to Franklin Sanborn that for years by that point he'd been feeling, quote, "a steady, strong desire to die." End quote. In that same letter, he drew a parallel between himself and Samson, the Old Testament judge who, in his final act, pulled down a building on top of a horde of partying Philistines along with himself. Harper's Ferry was John Brown's attempt to be like Samson. I don't think he ever meant to get out of there alive, and with the help of his slimy, conniving backers in the Secret Six, he meant to pull Virginia's house down on top of its people. Here's Horowitz's take on Brown's objectives in Midnight Rising. Quote, "No single passage of Scripture defined Brown. In the course of his life, he took inspiration from a multitude of biblical figures. Nor is it possible to pinpoint when he first saw shades of Samson's story in his own. But he referred to Samson's victory in his writing well before Harper's Ferry, and his prison letters suggested he had mulled the parallels between the biblical hero and himself for many years. Brown's identification with Samson also illuminated many aspects of his Virginia mission that otherwise defied explanation. The first mystery concerned his attack plan. What exactly was it? Brown's own version kept shifting. In court, he said he planned to run slaves north to freedom, as he'd done in Missouri. He later retracted this, saying he had hoped to arm slaves without any bloodshed, so they could defend themselves in the South. At other times, he spoke of a mountain-based guerrilla campaign that would oppose U.S. troops if necessary and carve out a provisional state, ultimately toppling the government. His men provided a more consistent picture of what they thought Brown intended, at least in the campaign's first stage. In their view, Brown planned to seize the armory, carry off its weapons, and quickly move back into the mountains with liberated slaves and any others who joined them. Some of Brown's men were also under the impression that similar strikes were to be made elsewhere in the South, by Allied parties. The detailed maps and other documents found at the Kennedy farm further suggested that Brown had well-laid plans for an extended campaign across the South, and his confidants described military preparations he had made over many years, including close study of historical precedents and sketches of mountain forts he intended to build. But when Brown finally launched his strike, he gave little sign of pursuing any of his purported plans. Where was the mountain base he spoke of establishing, or the log readouts he diagrammed for Frederick Douglass, Franklin Sanborn, and his own children? The Maryland schoolhouse and the Kennedy farm were meager strongholds, particularly if Brown envisioned large numbers of men following him back into the hills. With winter approaching, how would he feed and shelter those who flocked to his mountain refuge? For that matter, why did Brown fail to take even a modest supply of food for the small force he led across the Potomac? Brown's behavior in Harper's Ferry didn't accord with his alleged plans either. He said he had chosen to target the town because of its vast supply of arms. If so, why did he leave the town's 100,000 guns untouched during the time he controlled the armory, arsenal, and rifle works? How did he plan to transport these weapons? And why was he bringing his own guns forward to the schoolhouse when Harper's Ferry held an abundant store? Brown's handling of civilians was also puzzling. He took white men hostage not only as a shield but also to trade for able-bodied blacks. That, at least, is what he told his prisoners and, later, reporters. He ultimately collected about 40 hostages, more than he could easily handle, and they gave him an ample pool from which to barter for black men. Yet Brown took no steps to trade any of his prisoners, not a single one. Nor did he alert blacks to his intentions, either before or during the attack. He specifically cautioned Cook against doing so, and once the mission was underway, very few blacks apart from the slaves taken with Lewis Washington and John Allstott had any way of knowing who the insurgents were or why they'd come. The great majority of slaves in Jefferson County lived on farms at some distance from Harper's Ferry. How were they to learn of Brown's crusades so they could join it? Even more mysterious, and ultimately disastrous, was Brown's failure to budge from his position at Harper's Ferry. His supposed plans centered on mobility and surprise: a lightning strike on the armory, the swift liberation of plantation slaves, a move into the hills, and rolling attacks along the chain of mountains reaching into the south. But as soon as Brown took Harper's Ferry, he became completely immobile, barely moving for 30 hours after he breached the armory gate. He failed to properly secure the Potomac Bridge, which was crucial to his maneuverability, and he concentrated most of his tiny force in a fortified but exposed position at the armory. The 5 men he posted at the rifle works were likewise stationary. Having established these vulnerable beachheads, as well as a smaller one at the arsenal, Brown proceeded to linger for no discernible reason until he was surrounded and massively outgunned. Brown never gave satisfactory explanations for any of this behavior. The claim that he had deviated from his plans because compassion compelled him to care for rail passengers and prisoners made little sense. He knew that trains stopped in town at night, and he had always intended to take hostages. Did he have no advanced plan for dealing with these challenges? And if the welfare of civilians was his greatest concern, why did he refuse to surrender, or at least to release his prisoners, once it became apparent that his situation was utterly hopeless? Instead, despite ample warning and obvious preparations for an attack by troops outside, Brown chose to make a last stand in the engine house, endangering the hostages and his remaining accomplices, including his badly wounded son and 2 or 3 others who told him they wanted to lay down their arms. Brown's surviving men couldn't explain his actions either. Some of them said that their commander anticipated thousands of reinforcements, but no trace of this mysterious legion was ever found. Captain Brown was all activity, though I could not help thinking at times he appeared somewhat puzzled, wrote Osborne Anderson, who got away. Charles Tidd, another escapee, was less charitable. He felt Brown had attacked with too few men, failed to deliver on his promise to burn bridges, and then resisted the pleas of his men to withdraw. At one point during the battle, while moving arms into position at Maryland, Tidd went down to the Potomac Bridge. Some of the boys begged of me to go and try to persuade him that it was best to leave there, but I could not make him think so, he said. Kagi was likewise rebuffed. Of the 16 men posted with Brown on the Virginia side of the Potomac that day, all but Osborne Anderson would be killed, or captured and sentenced to hang. 4 months later, having made his way to New England, Tidd told Annie Brown, "I sometimes feel as if the old man murdered the boys. After all that was said against going to Harper's Ferry, and the opposition of the whole company, to think that he should have stayed there so long, until they were all taken or slaughtered." He also told Higginson that Annie's slain brothers, Watson and Oliver, had opposed their father's plan most of all. End quote. I said in Part 4 that it might have been better for Virginia and for the entire South if Brown had either been killed outright in the assault on the engine house or lynched by the townspeople immediately afterward. How different things might have been if Lieutenant Green had just grabbed his combat sword that day instead of the light ceremonial one that bent double when he tried to stab Brown with it. I don't know that for certain, obviously, but the reason I suggest it is because the very public trial and execution gave Brown a golden opportunity to be his fanatic self in the papers nationwide, and especially in the Northeast. And he got started right away with that interview I just read a little while ago. He would continue throughout his time in prison, writing and receiving letters from his family and friends and increasing numbers of fans in the North. One person less than enthusiastic about Brown's martyrdom, but very pleased at the prospect of his death, was Mahala Doyle, wife of one and mother of two of the victims of the Potawatomi Massacre. She sent a letter to Brown in prison in which she said, quote, "I confess that I do feel gratified to hear that you were stopped in your fiendish career at Harper's Ferry with the loss of your two sons. You can now appreciate my distress in Kansas, when you then and there entered my house at midnight and arrested my husband and two boys, and took them out in the yard and in cold blood shot them dead in my hearing. Oh, how it pained my heart to hear the dying groans of my husband and children. You can't say you did it to free our slaves. We had none, and never expected to own one. My son John is very desirous to be at Charlestown on the day of your execution, that he might adjust the rope around your neck. I do hope and trust that you will meet with your just reward." End quote. Brown never responded to that letter. This is how Goodrich continues on the evolving attitudes of Northerners towards Brown in the month leading up to his execution. Quote, "But while many in the South screamed for his blood, a growing sympathy for Brown was developing in the North. Although abolitionists had naturally cheered his attempt to foment a slave insurrection, the vast majority of Northerners viewed the raid on Harper's Ferry as a wild and reckless act of a maniac. As the days passed and the trial at Charlestown continued, however, a transformation took place in the public mind. Beaten and stabbed, wounded and bleeding, unable even to stand, the old man, far from bowing down to the mighty, hateful host all around him, remained true as steel to himself, clinging throughout the trial to his beliefs with a tenacity that impressed even his enemies. From a crazed old fool with a blood-stained past, John Brown was increasingly viewed by those of the North as an incredibly brave, solitary soldier who saw his duty to God and, in the teeth of men and law, did not hesitate to do it. Hundreds of letters poured into Brown's Charlestown jail cell from people thrilled by his example. Manly, heroic, saintly, even godly. The words of support lifted the old man's spirits. "He shall make the gallows glorious like the cross," Ralph Waldo Emerson declared with a smile. End quote. One thing Brown's survival of the Engine House assault did was put Virginia Governor Henry Wise in an impossible bind. The outcome of the trial was all but a foregone conclusion. Brown clearly had to be sentenced to hang, and he was. The only conceivable defense he might have had was insanity, but he declined that himself, not wanting his actions to be seen by the public as the acts of a madman. But even given Brown's obvious guilt, Wise still had the power to commute the sentence to life in prison, or even pardon him completely. And while a full pardon was probably never a real possibility, Wise might have had very good political reason for commuting the sentence to life in prison, especially as public sentiment towards Brown changed in the North. After all, if Brown's intent from the beginning had been to make himself a martyr, to hang him would be to give him exactly what he wanted. Almost definitionally, there's no better way to solidify someone's status as a martyr than by public execution. If the sentence was commuted to life in prison, on the other hand, it was possible that, without a big spectacular event like a public execution, Brown would just rot away in prison for the next 10 or 20 years until his death, and abolitionists as well as the North more generally would gradually forget about him. But through his correspondence with Brown's Northern sympathizers pleading for his life, Wise became convinced of their culpability in the attack. In a few cases, like the Secret Six, that culpability was very direct and literal, whether Wise knew it or not. But in most cases, the culpability was more spiritual. Brown was, in a sense, only a symptom of the disease in the public mind of the North, like Fleming argues. For a man to seek out political martyrdom and reasonably expect to attain it, there must first be a large enough segment of the population he's a part of which is willing to canonize him. Which is to say, they not only sympathize with the cause he supports, but also approve of his methods, or at least can be convinced to do so. No sane person today would ever try to become a martyr for the cause of prohibition by blowing up a liquor store, right? It's a cause that no one supports, and even if they did, there wouldn't be many people who would condone endangering or killing innocent people for something like that. There's no market demand for a martyr like that, you might say. But in 1850s America, there was an absolutely booming market for the kind of martyr who would gladly see another Haitian Revolution in Virginia. And when it came down to it, the Northern public was never going to care about the details of Brown's plan that didn't add up, about the fact that he never seemed to try very hard to actually accomplish what he said his goals were. Brown was selling a martyrdom story, and his supporters swallowed that story hook, line, and sinker. The public bought that story so hard that it's still commonly believed today. I speak from personal experience on this. This is the story I was taught as a kid in elementary school. It was simply taken for granted that Brown was being truthful and consistent about his stated objectives, and that this was a noble if misguided attempt to accomplish an ultimately noble goal. And the thing is, to a child's mind, John Brown just ends up looking like a good guy, even if lip service is paid to the questionable nature of his methods. Again, I speak from personal experience here, as a kid who was taught this stuff in school. Brown is pretty easy to slot into the narrative of the Civil War as a good guy, just on the basis that he was against slavery. If, that is, you ignore all the pieces that don't fit, as we've been over. But John Brown was no hero, and I hope I've thoroughly driven that point home by now. And not only was he not a hero, he wasn't even a decent man. He was a deeply deluded and deranged fanatic of a heretical religious sect. He was a deadbeat husband and father and a habitual liar. He was a failure in seemingly every endeavor he put his hand to the extent that he saw no alternative in the end but to take his own life, but was too full of pride to do it privately. Instead, he chose to do it in this extravagant public way, making himself a martyr and dragging 2 of his own sons down with him, along with 14 of his other men, 2 slaves, 4 Harper's Ferry civilians, 1 U.S. Marine, and ultimately the entire nation. And let's not forget that he married a 16-year-old girl when he was 33, had 13 children with her, and proceeded to leave her and most of the kids basically destitute in North Elba for a large chunk of that marriage while he ran off crusading and martyring himself for his cause. I've said this before and I'll say it again now. There should be nothing controversial about John Brown. The fact that there is a sign that we're still buying his own martyrdom narrative today. In the public frenzy leading up to the execution, there were many rumors of rescue plots, most of them outlandish, some more well thought out, a couple involving members of the Secret Six. Ultimately, none of them were acted on. Governor Wise did not commute the sentence, and as we know, Brown was executed by public hanging on December 2nd, 1859. 4 more of his captured men followed him to the gallows 2 weeks later on December 16th, and the last 2, Aaron Stevens and Albert Hazlitt, were executed on March 16th, 1860. As for the Secret Six, Although a large amount of their correspondence with Brown was found in the Kennedy farmhouse after the raid, clearly implicating them in the plot, none of them ever faced any consequences for inciting treason and slave insurrection. Mostly, and depending on what counts as consequences. As we said in Part 4, Theodore Parker was in Rome dying of tuberculosis at the time of the raid. As if we needed any more evidence that this reverend was not a Christian, here's Edward Renahan in his book, The Secret Six. Quote, "At Rome, Theodore Parker spent the day of John Brown's execution in quiet seclusion, contemplation, and prayer. His only visitor was one of his doctors. In Parker's darkened bedroom, the physician, an Englishman of noble birth whose patients included most of the British diplomatic community in Rome, mentioned that Brown had been compared to Garibaldi in a recent London Times article. The doctor wondered aloud what Brown might think of the analogy. 'I could not say,' replied Parker, gasping amid one of the prolonged bouts of coughing that every attempt at speech now triggered. Recovering after about a minute, he continued briefly, 'I shall be seeing Brown soon. We two have an appointment. My old friend and I are booked on separate trains to the same distant place. I shall ask him when I see him there. Hold a séance, and I shall let you know the answer.' Now more coughing, more blood in the white napkin, going on for several minutes this time. 5, 6, 7. Then, settling down again and smiling dolefully, Parker concluded, 'Yes, good doctor, hold a séance, as old Garrison will most assuredly do, and should I get through, should I even be a thing that would know to want to get through, I'll give you that, and oh so many other answers.'" End quote. Parker succumbed to the tuberculosis in May 1860 at the age of only 49. I'll leave it up to you to consider whether his early death might have been some kind of divine consequences for his support of insurrection and mass murder. But as weird as the spirituality of these transcendentalists was, it gets even weirder. Remember that Howe and Theodore Parker were the same two guys who hatched that weird child adoption scheme without telling Howe's wife. Here's Renahan again. Quote, "Several months after Parker's death, Sam and Julia Ward Howe were among those present at the Massachusetts State House to watch John Andrew, now governor of the Commonwealth, present the state legislature with a gift bequeathed to it by the late minister, the British rifle Parker's grandfather had captured at the Battle of Lexington. After a brief but very appropriate address, remembered Julia Ward Howe, the governor pressed the gun to his lips before giving it into the keeping of the official guardian of such treasures. In the end, one of the most precious gifts Parker had to leave the people of his state was the relic of a man who, like John Brown, had insisted on exacting blood payment for liberty's absence." The Howes had a stranger souvenir by which to remember Parker. For some reason that Dr. Howe couldn't quite fathom, the Florentine physicians who tended Parker at his death sent Howe his old friend's brain floating in a jar. Howe was horrified, as was his entire household. The brain was placed on the top shelf of a back cupboard, after which the family did their best to forget that it was there. End quote. The only one of the six that I would put in the category of having suffered any consequences for supporting Brown was Gerrit Smith. He was punished by his own mind after his letters to Brown were discovered in the Kennedy farmhouse and published in the newspapers. From Renahan, quote, "The exposure of the nigger-worshipping insurrectionists," ran a headline in the Copperhead New York Herald. The Herald gained and printed text of the letters found in Brown's possession, as well as several letters purchased from the still annoying and dangerous Hugh Forbes. All of the six, save for Parker, were named and implicated, just as, somewhat erroneously, was Wendell Phillips, several letters from whom were found in Brown's bags. "This is no list of low-born, ignorant, and despised traitors to the Union and its states," ranted the Herald. "It is no concoction of local disaffection. It shows that the treason had infested all classes." In an editorial several days later, the Herald continued in the same vein. "So accustomed have thousands of our citizens become to sit under and follow the higher law that many have forgotten their paramount duty to their country. The Herald sent a reporter to find Gerrit Smith and interview him. On his way to Peterborough, the reporter stopped at a tavern in nearby Oneida. Smith, the tavern keeper told the reporter, was seriously disturbed, losing his mind. The innkeeper, who doubled as a telegraph operator, had seen a great deal of Smith recently. "He is telegraphing from here all the while," said the innkeeper. When the correspondent arrived at Peterborough, he found the whole village much excited. The general expectation was that Smith was about to be kidnapped and transported south for trial with Brown. Men of the community were taking turns guarding Smith's mansion. Smith seemed in terrible shape. The agitation has not only impaired his health, but is likely to seriously affect his excitable and illy balanced mind, wrote the Herald reporter. He is a very different man from what he was 12 months since. His calm, dignified, impressive bearing has given way to a hasty, nervous agitation, as though some great fear was constantly before his imagination. His eye is bloodshot and restless as that of a startled horse. He has lost flesh, and his face looks as red and rough as though he had just returned from one of Old Brown's Kansas raids. When the reporter asked Smith about Harper's Ferry, Smith flew into a frenzy. "I am going to be indicted, sir, indicted," he ranted. "You must not talk to me about it. If any man in the Union is taken, it will be me." The Herald's reporter closed his narrative with his own indictment. "I sum up my experience at Gerrit Smith's home thus. He is in evident alarm and agitation, inconsistent with the idea that his complicity with the plot is simply to the extent already made public. I believe that Brown's visit to his house last spring was intimately connected with the insurrection, and that it is the knowledge that at any moment, either by the discovery of papers or the confession of accomplices, his connection with the affair may become exposed, that keeps Mr. Smith in constant excitement and fear." Always unstable, Smith's mind gave way. Or at least he gave the very strong impression that his mind had given way, within 2 weeks of Harper's Ferry. But interestingly, in the midst of his mental collapse, he managed a few key sane and sensible acts. He sent his brother-in-law to Boston and Ohio to find and destroy letters that might further incriminate him. He sent Edwin Morton, who knew so much of Smith's involvement with Brown, overseas to tutor a Smith's son who was away at Cambridge. And then, with all the housekeeping of self-preservation completed, he suffered a breakdown. Smith went down under a troop of hallucinations, reports his biographer Frothingham. He thought he was an outcast, reduced to poverty, hunted for life. He believed that certain unnamed people meant to carry him around the country in a cage and submit him to horrible tortures. He spent long hours brooding in silence, gentle as usual, but melancholy, and spoke repeatedly of having to go to Virginia to be with Brown. Smith, reported the Herald, was haunted with the idea that he was culpably responsible for all the lives that have been and will be sacrificed on account of the affair at Harper's Ferry. On November 7th, Smith was committed to an asylum for the insane in Utica, New York. A report in the Herald of November 12th stated that Smith had been coaxed to the asylum by being given the impression he was actually going to join Brown in Charlestown. This account is substantiated by Caleb Calkins, Smith's clerk, who wrote in a memoir that Smith became wild, was determined to go to Virginia and be with John Brown in Charlestown, left his home for that purpose, talked repeatedly about it, determined to suffer if necessary with Brown, went off with the undoubting expectation of going to Virginia. Smith's case, reported the Herald, was one of decided lunacy, and his mind was considerably disordered. The article quoted a letter from Smith's physician stating that Smith was quite deranged, intellectually as well as morally, and he is also feeble physically. End quote. 3 days after Brown's execution, a senatorial committee headed by James Mason of Virginia was formed to investigate the culpability of any Northern conspirators in Brown's plot, since all the South was sure he must have had Northern backers. The chief inquisitor of the committee was none other than a senator from Mississippi, Jefferson Davis. But the committee turned out to be fairly inept and ineffective. Only 4 of the Secret Six were ever summoned to appear. Parker was out of the country, and Higginson wasn't summoned either, which he seems to have actually taken offense to. Smith was released from the asylum in December, but was released from his summons on account of his still shaky mental health. Sanborn was summoned, but just didn't go. Howe and Stearns were the only ones who actually testified to the committee, and both, of course, lied through their teeth under oath. This is Renahan again. Quote, in testifying before the Mason Committee on February 3rd, Howe categorically denied his prior knowledge of the Harper's Ferry raid. In all your conversation or communication with Brown, asked Senator Doolittle, had you ever, at any time, from him any intimation of an organized attempt or effort on his part to be made to produce an insurrection among the slaves in the slave states of the South? Never, replied Howe confidently. On February 24th, Stearns did the same under questioning from Senator Collamer. Did you, asked Collamer, at any time before the transaction at Harper's Ferry, in any way, directly or indirectly, understand that there was any purpose on the part of Brown to make any inroad upon the subject of slavery in any of the states? Stearns shook his head. No, sir, not except that Brown was opposed to slavery, and as he had in Kansas, he would work again. I did not suppose that he had any organized plan. After a few minutes of questioning around the subject, Collamer once again essayed the topic directly. Had you any idea that these arms were to be used for any such purpose as making an inroad into any state? Stearns thought for a moment, then said, I think I do not understand you. Collamer, exasperated, pounded his fist down on the table of papers before him. John Brown has made an inroad into Virginia, exclaimed Collamer loudly, with force and arms to relieve slaves. You understand that? Stearns nodded. Yes, sir. Collamer stood and looked down at Stearns in his chair before delivering the final question. Now, demanded Collamer, did you ever, before that took place, have any intimation of what was contemplated to be done, intended to be done, by him? Stearns shook his head once more. No, sir, I never supposed that he contemplated anything like what occurred at Harper's Ferry. Under questioning from Chief Inquisitor Jefferson Davis of Mississippi and Virginia's James Mason, Stearns answered shrewdly when asked whether or not he approved of Brown's actions at Harper's Ferry. Carefully threading his way through the gray area between complicity and sympathy, Stearns confidently endorsed actions he had already denied prior knowledge of in his perjured testimony, finding a safe way to praise Brown's enterprise while maintaining his own innocence and insulating himself from prosecution. I should have disapproved of it if I had known of it, said Stearns, but I have since changed my opinion. End quote. Stearns and Howe perjured themselves without consequence. The rest never appeared before the committee at all. To sum all this up, before I can finally put John Brown to rest and not talk about him anymore, here's Renahan one more time. Quote, through the years, there were sporadic, hushed visits to John Brown's lonesome Adirondack grave. Higginson, Sanborn, and Stearns each went alone, without fanfare, more than once, although Howe and Smith did not. At first, the visits were ostensibly to the Brown family, the remnants of which lingered at the spot for a few short years before resuming that nomadism that had always been typical of Brown and his brood. Only after Mary departed for territories west did the visits become more blatantly a function of decades-long mourning. Only then did they become more clearly pilgrimages to a shrine. After Mary was gone, the modest house became, for a time, an open, abandoned place. It was here that the amateur naturalist Higginson, characteristically combining his pilgrimage to the grave with his passion for ornithology and robust hikes, tossed the knapsack and binoculars he had carried through the woods from the train station many miles distant. For Stearns, the house was a place where his carriage driver was instructed to wait while the master stood for an hour or more by the rock below which was Brown. And for Sanborn, during a long and strange night in the 1870s, the house was a place where he slept alone and awoke after midnight to see the ghostly silhouette of his long-dead friend swinging from a noose. Who can say whether the house was, or is, haunted. But we know that Higginson, Sanborn, and Stearns were haunted. And we know that even Smith, swimming in an ocean of denial, was equally haunted, if from a distance. We know less about Howe, who had an odd propensity for eschewing responsibility, kinship, friends. We do not know whether or not a white-bearded ghost stalked him as it did the others. We, in the end, doubt it. Howe was neither intimidated by nor in natural awe of larger-than-life heroes. He was considered by many a larger-than-life hero himself. He had, after all, been on a first-name basis with Paul Revere, Lafayette, and Dickens. While not unimpressed with John Brown, Howe was not likely to consider Brown unique among his legendary acquaintances. End quote. Shortly before his death in 1911, at the age of 87, Higginson would write to a friend about his thoughts looking back on his actions with the benefit of full hindsight of the war and its cataclysmic effects on the nation. This quote I'm about to read, I think, is the absolute epitome of Fleming's disease in the public mind and how its effects lingered long after the war. Higginson writes, quote, "We did what we did. In the end, we were trying to do right. And I believe, in the greatest measure, we did do right. The result of the attack at Harper's Ferry, the hastening of inevitable disunion and civil war, was good, healthy, positive. My one perennial wish, however, is that we would have achieved that end without the sacrifice of Brown. I persist in the belief that I, at least, could and should have realized the need to protect John Brown from himself. I should have recognized how incapable he was. I should have perceived the madness that dwelled within him, the insanity that sat stealthily behind his great, selfless nobility. A counterproposal to his Harper's Ferry scheme should have been made, something that would have both attracted and protected Brown. In retrospect, I think the bombing of a few fine Southern buildings or a few famous Southern men with notes crediting the blasts to some choice Northern abolitionist groups would have done the job. Such action would have brought disunion quickly and without risk to anyone from our side. The Russian revolutionists, who were so efficient in making the tyrant Tsar Alexander II explode, have much to teach us about practical terror." End quote. What a wonderful altruistic guy, right? Instead of a slave insurrection, we should have gone with terror bombing of the South. I shouldn't go too hard on Higginson in particular for that, though. Like Brown, he was a symptom of Fleming's disease in the public mind. He'd fully drunk the Kool-Aid of his time and his political movement. He said it right there in that quote. The thinking was that disunion and civil war were inevitable, and it was best to bring them on quickly. But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Civil War wasn't inevitable. Nothing in history is, not without the decisions of the people involved. And looking back on this absolute catastrophe almost 50 years later, it's no wonder Higginson would feel the need to justify himself by thinking the whole thing was inevitable. He might have gone mad like Garrett Smith if he'd allowed himself to feel the full weight of the tragedy he'd helped bring on. Now, as John Brown left Kansas for good in late January of 1859, efforts were underway to finally pacify the territory. The legislature, with the approval of Governor Samuel Metairie, passed an Amnesty Act in February, which, according to the Herald of Freedom, quote, granted a general amnesty to extend to all political difficulties in the southern part of the territory. End quote. But if you think a simple act of the legislature was going to be enough to pacify Kansas territory, you probably haven't been paying much attention. The surprising thing is that it does seem to have somewhat worked. There wouldn't be any more high-profile events like the sacking of Lawrence, the Pottawatomie Massacre, any of the major gunfights of 1856, or the Mare de Zine Massacre. But even so, sporadic violence on the border would continue throughout 1859 and 1860 as Jayhawkers worked to punish Missourians entice or kidnap slaves into freedom, and line their own pockets in the process. Always keep in mind that in any chaotic situation like this, you have opportunists involved, as well as those truly committed to one side or the other. Although there were never a lot of Missouri slaves who took the opportunity to flee across the border, there were some, and there were constant Jayhawker efforts to entice or kidnap slaves into freedom as a way of striking back at Missouri. Along with that comes slave catchers who would be paid by the masters to bring runaway slaves back. And then you have the true chaotic neutral opportunists, men who would act as Jayhawkers, enticing slaves to run away to freedom and pretending to help them, while in reality they were biding their time and waiting for a reward to be offered for the runaway, at which time they would take the slaves back to their masters and collect. Charles Leonhardt writes of how the Danites dealt with those. Quote, "An organization of such man-stealers brought the more rabid abolitionists into the harness. Hines was such a man-stealer and followed it as a business. We hung him, after having tried him by a court of 12 men in camp. This was November 16th, 1860. Had a paper with these words written, 'Hung by the people of Kansas for man-stealing. Was riding a horse with a rope fastened to a limb, and the horse led from under him. This affair caused the hanging of 2 Free State men, Guthrie and Catlin, as horse thieves, but really as abolitionists. Whenever the ruffians returned according to the resolution adopted at Raysville to stay away forever, our men became indignant at their appearance, but mad if they did engage in their former outrages. They caught one Stephen Paddock, hung him to a tree. Hung as a returned border ruffian, was pinned to his head.'" End quote. And elsewhere, Leonhardt wrote, quote, "Russell Hines of Lynn County, a kidnapper, was tried and hung by a vigilance committee, the old Danites." End quote. These vigilance committees, or really vigilante gangs, were the forerunners to what would become the paramilitary guerrilla bands of the Civil War era. 2 of those names I said would be important, James Montgomery and Charles Jennison, were heavily involved in that. Of course, Governor Stewart over in Missouri was working on organizing the militia for defense, and still long before open hostilities broke out nationwide, a full-scale border war threatened to engulf Kansas Territory and Missouri. 1860 was also an election year, and the 1860 presidential election is remembered, for good reason, as the most contentious in American history, as well as one of the most starkly divided along sectional lines. Of course, it's been covered to death by people who know the politics of it a lot better than me, but I'll give a quick breakdown here, and what I really want to focus on is how it reflected what was going on inside Missouri at this time. Now, we all know this election was won by Abraham Lincoln, the first president to be elected from the upstart Republican Party. Lincoln took not even 40% of the popular vote, and he was helped considerably by the deep sectional rift within the Democratic Party that led to the Democrats nominating 2 candidates, John C. Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats and Stephen Douglas for the Northern Democrats. Rounding out the field was John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, who won the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. Lincoln took the entire North, plus Oregon and California, which was enough to win him the election with 180 electoral votes. Breckinridge came in second, winning Delaware, Maryland, and the entire South, all except for Missouri, which was the one state won by Douglas. Although Lincoln didn't have a particularly strong stance on the slavery issue, his party had a bit of a reputation for being radical abolitionists, and the abolitionists within the party had strongly opposed his nomination in the first place because he wasn't radical enough for their taste. Douglas was also a moderate on slavery, but had supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act on grounds of popular sovereignty. The Democratic Convention of that year was itself highly contentious, and many of the more strongly pro-slavery Southern delegates boycotted the convention and held their own, which led to the nomination of the strongly pro-slavery Breckinridge. Meanwhile, Bell's Constitutional Union Party had been formed by remnants of the now-defunct Know Nothing and Whig parties, and their platform was basically to save the Union at all costs. They wanted the radicals in the North and South to come to some compromise on slavery that would hold the Union together and prevent secession. And with those platforms, it makes perfect sense that Lincoln won the North, Breckinridge won the South, and Bell won a few states in the middle. But what's more relevant to this story is what was going on inside Missouri. Lincoln was almost a non-factor in Missouri. He unsurprisingly won only 2 counties and took barely 10% of the popular vote. The strong pro-slavery candidate Breckinridge was second to last, still with less than 20% of the vote. The real race in Missouri was between the moderate Democrat Douglas and the Compromise for the Union candidate Bell. Douglas narrowly beat out Bell by less than 500 votes, about 0.26%, and both Douglas and Bell came in at just over 35% of the popular vote. Now, the key point here is that, just judging from numbers, Missouri was even more divided politically than the nation as a whole was. For percentages of the popular vote, there were 4 candidates coming in at, roughly speaking, 35, 35, 20, and 10. It doesn't get much more even than that in a 4-way election. And the political divisions evident in this election would come to represent the same factions and forces that would tear Missouri apart once the war popped off. Here's Monahan in Civil War on the Western Border. Quote, "The Republican National Convention was scheduled to meet in Chicago in May. The Missouri Republicans, a minority residing in the eastern part of the state, favored admitting Kansas into the Union and hoped to nominate Edward Bates of St. Louis for president. Frank Blair had organized the party in Missouri. He was a stern-faced man, fond of his dry joke. A drooping mustache and long goatee made him look the part of a Southern planter. He had been reared a Democrat. His father, old Frank Blair, had gained wealth and great national influence under Andy Jackson. Father and son knew instinctively all angles of the political game. St. Louis was considered to be the largest foreign city in the United States. German refugees from the unsuccessful revolutions of 1830 and 1848 had immigrated there by thousands, attracted by the propaganda of Gottfried Duden. Frank Blair had cultivated a friendship with their spokesman, Henry Bornstein, a trained Austrian soldier, university graduate, playwright, and editor of a German newspaper, the powerful Anzeiger des Westens. Recent riots against foreigners, led by Ned Buntline for the Know-Nothing Party, had done much to unite the Germans in a solid voting bloc, important both in the election of 1860 and more important in case war followed it. At the Chicago Convention, the Missouri delegates found themselves outmaneuvered. Lincoln won the nomination, but they came back to St. Louis with the prospect of 2 cabinet posts, one for Bates and the other for Blair's brother, Montgomery, of Maryland. That's Montgomery Blair, the brother of Frank Blair, not James Montgomery, the Jayhawker. In case Lincoln was elected, which seemed likely, Kansas would certainly be in a top-drawer position, with the Western men holding the key. The Democrats split themselves in half by nominating 2 candidates, Squatter Sovereign Douglas and unconditional pro-slavery John C. Breckinridge. All candidates opened headquarters in St. Louis. Douglas in the Berthold Mansion at 5th and Pine Streets. Frank Blair, knowing that the Republicans were a minority, organized companies of wideawakes, young ward politicians who attended all meetings in military formation and saw to it that speakers were not interrupted. Many of the Germans, who had been Democrats since coming to America, joined the new party. Rich slave owners who feared the Republicans as abolitionists and had found no protection for their property in Douglas's middle-of-the-road squatter sovereignty would probably vote for Breckinridge. But the November ballot amazed all pollsters. Lincoln proved a negative factor, winning but 10% of the Missouri vote. He carried only Gasconade County and St. Louis, Bornstein's Germans. In the border ruffian areas, his vote was practically nil, except in Kansas City, where 80 bold Republicans formed in column of 2s under Kersey Coates, the Pennsylvanian who had volunteered as bodyguard for Governor Reeder at the Shawnee Mission. Locking arms, the determined Republicans marched to the polls, demanded Lincoln ballots, and waited to see them deposited in the ballot box instead of the wastebasket. The only contest in Missouri was between Douglas and Bell, both pro-Union candidates who wanted to evade the slavery issue. Douglas won by the narrowest of margins, 0.1%. Obviously, the people were Unionists, and in case of war might be expected to fight against secession, but the two United States Senators, James Green and Trustin Polk, were both pro-slavery. David Rice Atchison still maintained that he was out of politics. The new governor and lieutenant governor, Claiborne Jackson and Thomas C. Reynolds, were elected on the Douglas ticket and should oppose secession, but both men were anti-North by inheritance and association. Much-married Claib Jackson had invaded Kansas with his army of voters, and now he would be the legitimate commander-in-chief of the Missouri militia. The lieutenant governor, a short, chubby chap of 40 with dark eyes and refined features, claimed to have been born and reared in South Carolina, but his enemies said that he was a Jew from Prague. Highly educated in the classics, he read Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, spoke French, German, and Spanish fluently. He had served as interim charge d'affaires in Spain and preferred international to local politics. Yet he owed his present position to his skill in combining the Atchison pro-slavery forces against Thomas Hart Benton's St. Louis Germans. Moreover, Reynolds had seen enough of the gracious South Carolina atmosphere of black servants and gentlemanly leisure to admire it greatly. Several times he had acquitted himself with distinction on the field of honor. In a crisis, both Jackson and Reynolds might readily deliver Missouri to the Confederacy. After the election, the southern states began to secede. On the western border, Democratic politicians stirred up resentment with false statements which were believed by partisans. Lincoln was reported to have endorsed John Brown's raid. Boston millionaires were said to be financing Montgomery to hire horse and nigger thieves. Montgomery and his city slicker Jennison were reported to be operating a ring of desperate jayhawkers engaged in regular robbing. Stolen mounts were recognized up in Iowa, and jocular people said that the pedigree of every good horse was out of Missouri by Jennison. Witnesses claiming to be familiar with this traffic fled to Kansas City with stories about being driven out of the country for knowing too much. As soon as Lincoln was inaugurated, they said, these outlaws would begin butchering all pro-slavery men. Wasn't ex-preacher Montgomery quoting the Bible as Brown had done to justify the killing of slaveholders? End quote. I just want to point out here that although there were no Boston millionaires financing Montgomery, it wasn't all that outlandish at the time to think there might have been. There certainly had been big Massachusetts money financing abolitionists to settle Kansas since 1854, as well as covertly supporting John Brown. Just saying, it's a totally believable rumor. Monahan continues, quote, Missourians appealed to their neighbors in Arkansas and to the civilized nations in Indian Territory to join with them in common defense against the freebooters. At Little Rock, newspaperman Albert Pike became eloquent, as only he could, about aggression against Southern rights. Boston-born, Pike had been compelled by poverty to leave Harvard. Rumor said his first job as a schoolteacher had been terminated by an indictment for cruelty in beating a student. He had moved west, was now wealthy and respected, with an international literary reputation. Christopher North, editor of Blackwood's magazine in Edinburgh, had commended his style, and Ned Buntline, when enlisting the nation's talent for Western magazine, had got contributions from his pen. A versatile man, Pike had perfected himself in the law, had recently won a $140,000 suit for the Creek Indians, and therefore had great influence with them. In case of war, he might be able to guide the Five Nations on a new kind of warpath into Kansas. The propaganda, the fears, the threats of invasion and murder received renewed impetus when Judge Williams abandoned his court at Fort Scott and fled to Missouri, complaining that he could not convict a horse or nigger thief while Montgomery's men were in the country. In the court's absence, both factions administered their own kind of justice, hanging 4 men, 2 pro-slavery and 2 free state. All settlers were intimidated by bands of night riders who claimed to be free state or pro-slavery according to the politics of any man who owned a good horse or a cupboard full of victuals. End quote. The point I want to get across is that in Missouri specifically, as the Civil War kicked off, slavery would be a secondary issue to that of unionism versus secessionism. Remember, the strong pro-slavery candidate Breckinridge only took 20% of the vote there, while 70% was split between the 2 unionist candidates, who were moderate on slavery. There was a small but significant anti-slavery Unionist faction led by the Germans in St. Louis, and a much larger pro-slavery faction which would become split between Unionist and secessionist as the secessions got started at the tail end of 1860. And as a backdrop to all that, add in the last 6 years of near-constant, low-level guerrilla warfare just over the border in Kansas, with all the bitterness and hatred that kind of thing breeds. Add in the constant threat of Jayhawkers making incursions into Missouri, and you have a recipe for more chaos and more violence with the intensity dialed up to 11. Now, before we continue any further, this is not a series about the Civil War as a whole, and it's not a series about the causes of the war or the development of slavery in America and the politics surrounding it either. I know I've been talking a lot about the lead up to the war, the causes of the war, and a few things going on outside the Kansas-Missouri area. And that stuff is unavoidable. You can't really talk about early Kansas history without covering a lot of that. But as we go forward, we're going to narrow the scope quite a bit and really focus on the details of what's going on in the Trans-Mississippi Theater, particularly in Kansas and Missouri, and a little bit in Arkansas and Indian Territory, or what's now Oklahoma. In case you're not familiar with the terminology, the Civil War is broadly broken down into 3 main theaters. Trans-Mississippi means everything west of the Mississippi River. The Western Theater is everything from the Mississippi to the Appalachians, and the Eastern Theater is everything east of that. There's a couple other minor theaters, but those are the main ones. So we'll be focused on the far west in the Trans-Mississippi Theater. That being said, I will mention what's going on elsewhere from time to time so we can keep everything in context and kind of have a timeline in mind. But the point is, don't be surprised if I really gloss over the stuff going on outside the Kansas-Missouri area. It's not my focus, and I couldn't do justice to the entire Civil War anyway. If you want an extensive treatment of the entire war, I'd recommend Shelby Foote's trilogy. And while we're on the subject, I also highly recommend Thomas Fleming's book, A Disease in the Public Mind, for the lead up to the war, the attitudes surrounding slavery, and more importantly, the development of the deeper animosity between North and South that ultimately led to war. But to get back to our story, Kansas still wasn't a state yet when Lincoln was elected in 1860, since the Lecompton Constitution was defeated for good in 1858. The next attempt at a state constitution got started also in 1858, while the Lecompton Constitution was still in the works, when the by then official Free State Legislature called a constitutional convention at Leavenworth. I didn't mention the Leavenworth Constitution before because it really was never that big of a deal. It was drafted by a Free State Convention and therefore would have kept slavery out of Kansas, but it never gained any significant traction in the U.S. Congress, which was still controlled largely by the South at that point. They tried again in 1859, calling another constitutional convention at Wyandotte, a town which has since been absorbed into Kansas City. The Wyandotte Constitution, which was also free state, passed easily in the territory in October 1859, then also pretty easily passed the U.S. House of Representatives in April 1860. But the Senate was another story. Evenly divided as it was between free states and slave states, and the Kansas statehood bill was bogged down for the rest of the year. But all that changed when, about a month and a half after Lincoln's election, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana followed in January 1861, and at that point, with 6 southern states missing from the Union, and therefore 12 pro-slavery senators missing from the Senate, Kansas was admitted to the Union under the Wyandotte Constitution on January 29, 1861. Through the rest of the winter and spring of 1861, 5 more states would secede and join the new Confederacy: Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. This is Thomas Goodrich on the reaction in Kansas to the news of statehood. Quote, On the evening of January 29, 1861, Benjamin Simpson and other members of the territorial legislature were sitting in session at the Eldridge House in Lawrence. There were from 3 to 4 inches of snow on the ground, Simpson noted, signifying an end to a terrible year-long drought, and the night was windy and cold. Quoting Simpson now, "It must have been as late as 9 o'clock when Daniel R. Anthony came into the hotel with a sturdy stride and flashing eyes, and told us that the President of the United States had that day signed and approved the bill admitting Kansas into the Union. He brought with him and scattered around extras issued by a newspaper published at Leavenworth, announcing the joyful tidings and flaring headlines." Back to Goodrich. "With one voice, the assembly exploded in a wild celebration of shouts, cheers, and laughter. Men ran from place to place proclaiming the glad tidings," rang one reveler. "Cheering and music and all manner of exultation was heard everywhere through our streets." The news ran through the town like wildfire, an elated and now inebriated Ben Simpson added. Houses were lighted, doors were thrown open, and some were broken open. The people gathered in public places, toasts were drunk, songs were sung, speeches were made, and, well, the truth is that my recollection is not good after midnight. With incredible speed, the glorious word spread until the entire new state had joined the jubilation. While a grateful Charles Robinson quietly prepared to don his well-earned and long-postponed mantle as the first governor of Kansas, and while his archenemy, James Lane, after a miraculous political comeback, schemed his way toward the U.S. Senate, those Kansans of more modest aspirations were merely thankful that the territorial days were mercifully at an end, and that their new Western home had finally moved to America. "At last," sighed a Manhattan editor, "the great victory for which the people of Kansas have fought so many hard battles against the slave power, suffered so many acts of injustice at the hands of a corrupt and vindictive administration, and submitted to so many sacrifices and privations, is won. We are a free and sovereign state." The celebration on this snowy winter's eve was not dampened in the least by the looming prospect of war, nor the growing national crisis that would increasingly focus on a fort in Charleston Harbor. For 7 long years, the people of Kansas had fought the fight of the North, and the moment to set down a heavy load was at hand. And if the horrors of civil war did indeed engulf the nation, many in Kansas felt it was only fitting that all of America should finally join in. Some, like James Redpath, Julia Lovejoy, and James Montgomery, actually welcomed war. Even had these individuals, and many more just like them, been able to peer into the future and see what lay ahead for America, their attitude would not have changed in the least. Even could they have viewed for themselves the blood-soaked sod at Shiloh and Antietam, or the hideous heaps of corpses at Fredericksburg, Franklin, and a score of other slaughter pens, they would have felt the sacrifice a necessary one to atone for the sin of all sins, slavery. However, could these same people, now so lighthearted and gay, have looked ahead into their own future, it might have given them reason to pause. Could they have but gazed at the death and destruction and desolation that was coming to Kansas, at their own towns and villages enveloped in smoke and flame, at the bodies of friends, neighbors, and loved ones strewn about the fields and streets, it is doubtful few, if any, would have been so eager for the terrible storm that was now rushing down on them with the force of a tornado. End quote. Now I want to leave you with something to ponder as we get into the war proper. In particular, it's for a certain subset of people. People who would say, you know what? I understand the Civil War was terrible. It was America's greatest tragedy. But at the end of it all, the outcome was positive. The slaves were freed and the Union was held together. Those are good things. And this outcome overall was better than the alternatives, whatever those might have been. One thing that I think makes the Civil War all the more tragic is how eager some people were for it. People like the Secret Six, or John Brown, or James Montgomery. To me, it seems like pure delusion to be eager for something like this. Even if I try to put myself in the shoes of someone who doesn't have the benefit of hindsight like I do, and doesn't have any idea how bad it's going to get. But the thing is, even without hindsight, it's not that hard to predict the kinds of horrific things that are going to happen when you unleash the dogs of war onto the world. There's a YouTube video that made this point in about the most succinct way I've ever heard. It's from a channel called Burn These Books, and I'll link it in the show notes. I didn't watch this for research exactly, just happened across it while I was working on this series. It's not even about the Civil War, it's about the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 80s, which is a war I'm not the least bit familiar with. But it says something at the very end that I think is relevant to this story too, and really to the story of any war. He's making the point that, of course, the Soviets would have felt their reasons for going into Afghanistan were somehow noble, or at least justified. And then he says, quote, "The important question to ask before invading another country is not, are our goals noble? The question is, how many peaceful civilians are you willing to shoot? How many villages are you willing to destroy? And how much rape are you willing to sanction in the pursuit of your goals? If the answer to any of these is none, then war is not the answer." End quote. Of course, in our case here, we're not even talking about invading another country. We're talking about going to war with your own country, with your own brothers, figuratively speaking. These are the kinds of things you have to be okay with seeing done to your fellow countrymen if you say, yes, civil war is the route we want to take to resolve these differences. I don't mean to just preach to you about how war is bad. It's not exactly a groundbreaking or controversial thing to say, I know. I am not a pacifist in principle. I think there could potentially exist situations for which war would truly be the best solution. I don't know what those would be, but maybe they exist. But part of my purpose for doing this series is to show you the realities of these things on the ground, and to maybe get people to think twice about going to war the next time, no matter how noble the cause may be. Because regardless of the cause, everyone knows in advance that horrific things are going to be done to human beings, many of them non-combatants. It is impossible to predict how far that's going to go before it's all over, and when it gets out of hand, it can get out of hand in a hurry. And all this goes double for civil wars. Just like there's something uniquely bad about fratricide as opposed to murder more generally, there's something uniquely bad about civil war as opposed to war more generally. And I think, especially in a world like ours, where most people, myself included, have never been to war or seen it up close, it's good to be reminded of how bad things can get, so that we remember and maybe be less cavalier about jumping straight to civil war as a solution to our political disagreements, no matter how righteous we might feel about the cause we support. Now, as the secessions got going and the nation ramped up for war, the people of Kansas and Missouri were pretty unbothered at first. Nobody knew at the time just how bad this was going to get, and they thought, we've already been doing this for the last 6-7 years off and on. War is nothing new for us. Of course, the scale was about to ramp up immensely, but again, we know that from hindsight. James Henry Lane set up shop in Topeka and started campaigning for election to the U.S. Senate, all the while carrying on his political feud with Charles Robinson. Even after killing Gaius Jenkins in 1858, Lane succeeded in reviving his reputation enough to gain the Senate in April 1861. He arrived in Washington on April 13th, the day after the fateful shelling of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, which signaled the beginning of the war. And always the showman, Lane was quick to take advantage of the chaotic situation to promote his image. Robert Collins writes in his biography of Lane, quote, The Washington that Lane arrived in on April 13th was a city under siege. Lincoln had issued his call for 75,000 volunteers after the attack on Fort Sumter, and 2 days later Virginia chose to join the Confederacy. Maryland was hovering on the brink of secession. No one was certain if Union soldiers coming through the state to Washington would make it unscathed. That first night, Lane and Samuel Pomeroy took to the street in front of their hotel to make speeches. As soon as Lane stepped up, Confederate sympathizers shouted, "Mob him!" Lane, as ever in his element, met the calls with a threat of his own. His voice rising, he yelled, "Mob and be damned!" He warned his opponents that he had 100 men from Kansas in the crowd, all armed, all fighting men, just from the victorious fields of Kansas. They will shoot every damned man of you who again cries, "Mob, mob!" Lane's supporters cheered loudly as the hammers on their pistols were cocked. The Kansans were in the city not just to support the government cause. Since the days of Andrew Jackson, new congressmen and senators were followed by men from their home state looking for federal jobs. The ability of these legislators to reward men with patronage often determined if they would remain in office. The next day, Major David Hunter came to Lane's hotel room. Hunter was a member of General Winfield Scott's staff, and he asked for Lane's help. There were a few Union soldiers in Washington, and word had it that Confederates or their allies might try to capture President Lincoln. Hunter asked Lane to organize the Kansans in the capital into a company to guard the White House. The list of the men Lane assembled for this frontier guard now reads like a who's who of early Kansas. There were no prominent men among the officers, but the list of privates included Daniel Anthony, future mayor of Leavenworth and brother to suffragette Susan B. Anthony, Sidney Clark, future congressman, Thomas Ewing, Jr., relative of William T. Sherman, head of the LP&W Railroad and a future general, Marcus J. Parrott, who had just lost the contest for senator, and the other senator from Kansas, Samuel Pomeroy. In spite of its pedigree, the Frontier Guard seems to have been limited to one duty, albeit a prestigious one. According to the New York Tribune, Lane's men camped in the East Room of the White House to protect the president. They remained on guard for at least a week. On April 25th, a correspondent for the Tribune remarked on the odd sight of these rough Kansas guests posed in the gorgeous apartment, but added that in case of an attack, the guests would show they were meant rather for use than ornament. Lane's Frontier Guard even managed to be the first to capture a rebel flag, according to former member and consul general to China, D.H. Bailey, who spoke about his experiences to an Emporian newspaper in 1882. The story of the capture began in April, when a rumor surfaced that Confederate sympathizers were planning to take a bridge over the Potomac River. Lane's men were ordered to the scene, along with another volunteer company composed of Kentuckians. No enemy soldiers were found, but on the other side of the river there was a house flying a rebel flag. The owner of the house was badgered into lowering the flag, which Lane proudly displayed near his room at the Willard Hotel. As Union regiments finally arrived in Washington toward the end of April, the need for irregular units such as the Frontier Guard ended. In early May, Lane assembled a guard and marched them to the White House. They were met by President Lincoln, who thanked them for services rendered. After that, according to the Republican of May 9th, the Guard returned to the Willard Hotel, exchanged compliments with each other, and adjourned till the next meeting. Naturally enough, Lane's allies would call the Guard's service vital to the nation's security, while his enemies would dismiss it as useless political theater. Author Edgar Langsdorff researched and wrote a brief history of the Guard that was published in 1940. It must be remembered that Washington in 1861 was in a condition of hysteria, he wrote, and the Guard was a psychological factor of real importance in helping to calm the city's nerves, no matter what its military value may have been. Most authors writing about Jim Lane have agreed that it was around this time that he went from being an ally of President Lincoln to being something close to a friend. From that point on, Lane visited Lincoln every day he was in Washington. Views of this relationship largely depend on whether the author liked or disliked Lane. Leverett Spring, decades later, neatly summarized how Robinson and his allies saw the matter. Quoting Spring now, Lane's singular influence over Mr. Lincoln and the Secretary of War, Mr. Stanton, is one of the most inexplicable and disastrous facts that concern Kansas. It was the source of the heaviest calamities that visited the Commonwealth during this period, because it put him in a position to gratify mischievous ambitions, to pursue personal feuds, to assume duties and offices that belonged to others, to popularize the corruptest political methods, and to organize semi-predatory military expeditions. His conduct not only embarrassed the state executive and threw state affairs into confusion, but provoked sanguinary reprisals from Missouri. Back to Collins. In 2001, Craig Minor devoted a whole article in Kansas History to the relationship between Lane and Lincoln. He found that the senator and the president had much more in common than did the governor and the president. Lane and Lincoln were Westerners who spent some part of their lives in Indiana. They were born 5 years apart, Lincoln in 1809 and Lane in 1814. They were both strong public speakers. They both liked a good laugh and a good story. Perhaps more deeply, both men had melancholy streaks to their natures, dark moods that could drive them to despair. Recognizing such traits in each other might have led Lane and Lincoln to something more than just a political alliance, perhaps even to an actual friendship. 2, though they were opposed to slavery, neither was an abolitionist as Robinson was. Minor likened Lane's eventual radicalism over slavery to the zeal of a religious convert or to the former alcoholic who becomes a temperance activist. Lincoln intensely disliked slavery, but he refused for almost a year and a half to make it an open aim of the war. He feared that doing so too soon would drive away the border states and make recruiting in much of the country too difficult. Indeed, it may have been that Lincoln allowed Lane to make his radical statements on slavery in 1861 and 1862 as part of an overall strategy to prepare the public to take such a step. By contrast, the abolitionist in Robinson probably would not have allowed himself to be used in that way, and the independent politician in him would have caused him to speak out against Lincoln for not carrying through on the proper policy. And Robinson had faults of his own that made it hard for him to get as close to Lincoln as Lane did. William Cutler noted that he was not a party politician, meaning that Robinson would not follow Lincoln out of party loyalty, but only out of duty or personal loyalty. Robinson also failed to spend time in Washington presenting his side in any dispute with Lane that involved the president. There may have been something else that prevented Robinson from getting very far with Lincoln. The president would have needed men of action and decisiveness to carry out his policies and prosecute the war. Not even Jim Lane's enemies would have doubted that he was a man of action. Yet Charles Robinson appears to have been, if anything, a man of inaction. Although personally brave, Robinson seemed to shrink from outright confrontation. Lane, on the other hand, was more than willing to do just about anything to ensure that his side would come out on top. With the nation in the grip of civil war, such willingness was not just favorable, but could also be vital. Lane's tactics might not always be ethical, but as long as there was a means to rein him in, Lincoln would have thought Lane useful. On July 18, 1861, according to Sidney Clark, Lane delivered his first speech in the Senate on what the nation's policy should be now that war had begun. And here's Lane. I represent a constituency whose rights have been trampled underfoot by the slave oligarchy of this country. Fraud, cruelty, barbarism were inflicted on them by that power. The attempt is now being made by that power to overthrow the government, to destroy the Union. They have brought upon this conflict. If, in that conflict, the institution of slavery perishes, we will thank God that He has brought upon us this war. I do believe, Mr. President, that the institution of slavery will not survive, in any state of this Union, the march of Union armies, and I thank God that is so. Back to Collins. Lane's political enemies were not willing to grant him an inch, on this speech or on any other. Leverett Spring alleged that once Lane had gained the Senate, his eloquence did practically cease. On one or two occasions he broke through the restraints of the place and spoke in his natural vein. Old Jim thinks he's at Baldwin City, was the comment of a Kansan in the gallery. Lane's supporters, however, did not think he ought to restrict himself to making speeches to aid the war effort. Early in 1861, an editorial in the Leavenworth Conservative said, "Put Jim Lane at the head of our armies, and instead of months of idleness, we shall have victories every day, and a restored Union in 6 months." Lane himself seemed to agree, and that would lead to yet another controversial episode in an already contentious life. End quote. We'll come back to that controversial episode, but for now, however chaotic the situation was in Washington in those early days of the war, it was even more so back in Missouri. Lincoln issued his call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, and Missouri Governor Claiborne Jackson said no. Remember that despite being a slave state, Missouri was still in the Union and never would secede officially. But from the beginning, there were forces pulling on the state from both directions. Here's Monahan on the early scramble for power. Quote, "In mid-April, news of the firing on Fort Sumter set St. Louis trembling on the verge of madness. Pro-Union and secessionist factions unmasked. Plots, counterplots, treason, hysteria shook the streets, the levees, and the spring leaves unfolding in the parks. Lincoln called on the states for 75,000 volunteers, and Governor Jackson replied that Missouri would not furnish a single man to subjugate her sister states of the South. The governor appealed to Missourians to rise then and drive out ignominiously the invaders who have dared desecrate the soil which your labors have made fruitful, and which is consecrated by your homes. He immediately ordered a special session of the legislature and mobilized the militia. Envoys were dispatched to Jeff Davis for artillery to enable the people to capture the St. Louis arsenal. The German regiments, already partly trained, ignored Jackson's defiance and offered to fill Lincoln's quota. Before a reply was received, the distressing news came downriver that the United States arsenal at Liberty, across from Kansas City, had been taken by a mob. M. Jeff Thompson was organizing a battalion of rebels at St. Joseph. Ex-Senator Greene's brother was equipping a regiment north of the Missouri, and a dozen other bands of partisans were drilling. The only safeguard to federal authority in Missouri was now the St. Louis arsenal." End quote. The counterpart to Jackson on the Unionist side of the Missouri conflict was Frank Blair, and his right-hand man was Captain Nathaniel Lyon. Lyon was an old hand on the western border. Stationed at Fort Riley during the early settlement period in Kansas, he developed a seething hatred for all things Southern and pro-slavery. While he was at Fort Riley in 1855, an act of Jefferson Davis's War Department expanded the boundaries of the fort's territory and required the removal of the nearby Immigrant Aid Society settlement of Pawnee. From Monahan, quote, "Secretary of War Jefferson Davis backed the legislature's action by extending the boundary of the Fort Riley military reservation, thus wiping out the Pawnee settlers' landholdings and adding to the bitterness of tough little Captain Lyon, who dutifully drove the courageous settlers from their houses and scored another tally to his hatred of slavocrats. Lyon's own messmates complained about his disagreeable manners. He persisted in reading political tracts instead of playing cards. He even argued about religion. Fixing cold, unblinking blue eyes on unwilling listeners, he had declared, 'I am an infidel, perhaps an atheist. Socrates was nobler than Jesus.' Certainly Lyon was a dangerous man to have authority, come Civil War." End quote. Lyon was something of a fanatic by 1861, but at first was being held in check by the department commander, General William Harney, who sympathized with the secessionists but as yet was staying loyal to the Union as war broke out. Not wanting to alienate his secessionist friends, Harney took no action to secure the St. Louis arsenal, and to Lyon and Blair it appeared his defection to the Confederacy was imminent. Fully aware of the urgency of securing the arsenal, Blair went into action. He crossed the Mississippi River into Illinois, and from there shot off a telegram to the War Department explaining the situation and his suspicions of Harney. That resulted shortly in Harney being called away to Washington on pretense of attending a conference on strategy, leaving Captain Lyon in full command of all federal troops in Missouri. Meanwhile, Jackson's secessionist militia was in motion. Under General D.M. Frost, they established a camp at Lindell Grove on the edge of St. Louis and named it Camp Jackson. Lyon had time to ship many of the arsenal's weapons across the river to Illinois for security, but Camp Jackson would clearly have to be dealt with. In these chaotic early days of the war, when it was unclear where Missouri's allegiance would lie, a show of strength by either side might make a huge difference in determining the outcome. Here's Monahan again. Quote, "The surplus arms had been shipped from the arsenal, but Lyon feared the state's military display. He called a council with his volunteer officers on May 7, 1861. Carefully closing the door to prevent eavesdropping, Lyon walked nervously up and down the floor. 'We must take Camp Jackson,' he said, 'and we must take it at once.' Contradictory orders might come back with Harney any moment now. Tradition says that Lyon drove next day to the rebel camp, heavily veiled and in a woman's dress, a pistol under a basket of eggs ostensibly for sale. Unlikely, surely, for Lyon's spies knew all that was necessary about Lindell Grove, and his rough red beard could not be disguised by any veil. The night of May 8, 1861, a ship docked at St. Louis with heavy boxes marked marble, which turned out to be mortars and siege guns from Jeff Davis. If there had been any question about Frost's intentions, there could be none now. But still he pleaded innocence and sent a messenger to Lyon on the morning of May 10, 1861, asking for an explanation of rumors that his militia were to be attacked by United States troops. Before reaching the arsenal, the courier met Lyon, riding at the head of his brigade toward Camp Jackson. Streets, doorways, windows, housetops were black with people watching the 4 regiments of pasty-faced volunteers who marched well under their German officers. A battalion of bronzed regulars trudged behind Colonel T.W. Sweeney, grizzled Mexican war veteran with an empty sleeve pinned in the opening of his coat. The regiments deployed in battle line around Lindell Grove. Then Lyon handed his reply to the courier and watched him canter off among the tents. A crowd of civilians gathered behind Lyon's soldiers, among them William Tecumseh Sherman, who, after dabbling unsuccessfully with the legal profession in his brother-in-law's Leavenworth office, was now president of a street railway in St. Louis. Also in the crowd stood Ulysses S. Grant, mustering officer for the governor of Illinois, on vacation for a few days' rest from his duties in Belleville. As the crowd waited for a reply from Lyon's note, they heard 3 cheers among the tents. One-armed Sweeney thought this meant fight, and he ordered his battalion to move their cartridge boxes to the front of their belts. A few minutes later, the courier appeared. Lyon took the message and read it. General Frost begged time to consider. Lyon flattened the message on the pommel of his saddle and scribbled a reply. The general must surrender in 10 minutes, or the Federal troops would open fire. The courier galloped away and soon returned. "Sweeney," Lyon said, reading the second note, "they surrender." Rough little Lyon swung to the ground from his horse and was immediately kicked in the stomach by an aide's mount. Writhing on the ground, Lyon ordered the details of the capitulation. Acute pain could not divert the furious intensity of this commander's mind. Colonel Sigel was also hors de combat. His horse had slipped and fallen on the paved street, hurting the German's leg. A doctor ran forward with a bandage, and Sigel soon joined his regiment in a carriage. The disability of the 2 commanders caused some delay. Blair formed his regiment in single files on opposite sides of the street. The disarmed prisoners, 1,000 of them, marched in between, and the long column started for the arsenal. A mob stood along the sidewalks shouting, "Damn the Dutch!" and "Hooray for Jeff Davis!" Clods and stones pelted the soldiers. A drunken man tried to push through the file to the captives. A file closer shoved him back, down an embankment. The man turned and fired a pistol, wounding an officer. Bornstein ordered his men to return the fire. Redcoats had done the same in Boston Common, and a revolution followed. Disturbances occurred at other places on the line of march, with sporadic shooting. Sherman admitted, in his memoirs, running for his life to escape flying bullets. In all, 28 people were killed, 1 a babe in arms, and many more were wounded. 15 were shot down in one place. The column passed along Olive Street amid the banging of shutters. At the arsenal, the prisoners were packed into cramped quarters for the night, but assured that they would be properly paroled in the morning. Through the midnight streets, a roaring mob shouted, "To the Democrat office," the Republican paper, and Down with the Anzeige des Westens, a cry the anti-foreign American Party under Ned Buntline had used against these same Germans in 1852. The mayor ordered all saloons closed. Ex-Governor Sterling Price addressed a crowd in front of the Planters' House, vehemently arraigning the military despotism. In the morning, he boarded a train for Jefferson City, where he found the legislature in a furor of excitement. Sitting in special session, they had been notified about the capture of Camp Jackson. Wildly indignant, they passed a special military bill, gave the governor dictatorial power, appropriated $10,000 to encourage the Indians in the territory to retaliate against Kansans. $1 million was authorized to be borrowed from banks, and another $1 million to be raised by bonds for a state army. Truculent members returned from recesses with guns and bowie knives, leaning them against their desks and along the assembly chamber walls. Rumors said that Blair was bringing his Germans up the river to take the capital. In near panic, Governor Jackson commissioned Sterling Price, a major general, to organize the militia and defend the state government. End quote. The killing of 28 people, mostly civilians and including a baby, in a riot in the heart of St. Louis was an inauspicious beginning to federal efforts to pacify Missouri and keep it in the Union fold. The riots continued for several more days after the initial shooting, and wrapped up with the Unionist-secessionist conflict was ethnic resentment. With St. Louis's large German minority and the fact that much of the army Lyon used to force the surrender at Camp Jackson was made up of Germans, much of the American population, especially the secessionists, resented being ruled by foreign force. Martial law was imposed in St. Louis to pacify the unrest. But the word was out now that Unionists were using foreign soldiers to impose their will on Missouri. And just as men from across the North were answering Lincoln's call for volunteers, men from across Missouri were rallying to the secessionist banner, bringing whatever motley assortment of shotguns, squirrel rifles, and revolvers they could scrape together. What they were lacking in the beginning was organization and strong leadership. Governor Jackson turned out to be indecisive and appeared not to know what to do with this upswell of support for his side. Monahan continues, quote, General Harney arrived in St. Louis the day after the capture of Camp Jackson. He was much upset by his subordinates' aggressive action during his absence. The wealthy friends of his socially prominent wife suggested that the situation might be partially alleviated by ordering the German regiments out of the city. American-born citizens, he was told, resented being ruled by foreigners. Hundreds of young men from the best families were riding south to join the Confederacy, or west to join Jackson and Price, hoping that one army or the other would expel the Dutch. Blair disapproved of any appeasement, and he feared that the advantage he and Lyon had gained for the federal government might be lost. He hurried a delegation to Washington to explain his side of the situation to Lincoln. Harney's conservative friends sent another delegation to explain their position. The harassed president, with frantic men pounding hourly on his office door, would have to decide what to do in Missouri. He wanted peace, and he wanted to hold Missouri for the Union. The Blairs knew the situation and ranked high in the administration. Both parties returned without a decision, but on May 20, 1861, a messenger rang Blair's doorbell in St. Louis and delivered a communication from Lincoln. Blair broke the seals and read the letter. It included an order relieving Harney of the command of the Department of the West and a commission for Lyon as brigadier general. The president asked Blair to keep the papers in confidence and use them at his discretion. Next day, May 21, 1861, General Harney announced that he had concluded a truce with Governor Jackson, the federal government making a treaty with a sovereign state. By this agreement, the governor promised not to invoke the state's military act, and Harney agreed to recognize Missouri's neutrality and use his army to enforce state laws. Blair's next action will always be open to argument. Some have maintained that the truce and due recognition of the state's neutrality would have kept Missouri in the Union and prevented the next 4 years of guerrilla warfare. Blair himself considered the election of Lincoln a popular repudiation of state rights. To his mind, the time had come to assert the dominance of the central government, especially since his party sat in the driver's seat. On May 20th, 1861, as Harney began moving the German regiments out of St. Louis, Blair sent him Lincoln's order of removal from command. Governor Jackson saw the shadow of the federal whip and knew that he would be eclipsed unless he could outwit the new commander. He asked for a conference at once. Brigadier General Lyon set the time and the place, June 11, 1861, at the Planters' House in St. Louis. Governor Jackson came with his secretary, Thomas Snead, and his major general, Sterling Price. Frank Blair attended the council to explain his party's position. The men sat down, and Blair monopolized the conversation, his tired, whining, falsetto voice repeating every plank in the Republican Party platform. Jackson and Price both presented their pleas for neutrality, promising peace and loyalty if Missouri would be allowed state sovereignty. Lyon, who had been a Democrat until Frank Pierce truckled to the slave power, fidgeted in his seat. A soldier versed in science and philosophy, he had continually made his messmates uncomfortable with his outspoken opinions. As the conference dragged on hour after hour, he became tense and nervous. Finally, he could stand it no longer. Now, if ever, was the time to snap state rights across his knee. The little redhead leaned back in his chair, and his Connecticut voice struck like the gong of a grandfather's clock, calm, timeless, and cold as death. "Rather than concede to the state of Missouri," he boomed, "for one single instant the right to dictate to my government in any manner however unimportant, I will see you—" He rose from his chair, spurs clinking, and pointed his freckled finger at Governor Jackson's breast. "And you—" He touched the bosom of General Price. "And you—" He prodded solemn Blair. "And you—" He poked Secretary Snead, who had been watching him as an enemy, and now thrilled at the man's pluck. "And every man, woman, and child in the state, dead and buried." Lyon turned formally to the governor. "This means war," he said, taking out his watch with a sunburned hand. "In an hour, one of my officers will call for you and conduct you through my lines." The shaggy little commander turned on his small heels and marched down the hall. Snead listened with rapture until the clank of Lyon's saber became inaudible. What a soldier! Snead wished that the grim little man might be on the southern side in the war ahead. End quote. The battle lines were drawn. There would be no peaceful neutrality for Missouri. It's always interesting to play with the what-ifs of history. What if X, Y, or Z had just gone a little bit differently? How would that have changed things going forward? There's a whole genre called alternate history built around picking out a point like that and speculating about how things go from there. And there are some big ones in the Civil War. Special Order 191 is probably the biggest one that most people know about if they're into this kind of thing. We might actually talk about that a little bit in a later episode. But there are plenty of others to pick from. What if Lieutenant Greene had brought his combat sword to Harper's Ferry and killed John Brown outright during the Engine House assault? What if the Confederates had never fired on Fort Sumter? What if Stonewall Jackson hadn't died after being accidentally hit by friendly fire at Chancellorsville? What if Joshua Chamberlain had failed to hold the line on Little Round Top on the second day of Gettysburg? Or if Lee hadn't ordered Pickett's charge on day 3 and had simply retreated to fight another day? The possibilities are almost endless, but the one relevant to our story that I want to point out is Nathaniel Lyon. Namely, what if anybody else had been in position to take over command of the Department of the West from Harney in the spring of 1861? As we just saw, Lyon was utterly uncompromising in his attitude toward the Missouri secessionists. There was no room even for neutrality in his vision of what needed to happen there. And look, I'm not here to litigate the national level politics of this decision. Maybe he was right to take the hardline stance he took. If you're the federal government, you're in a situation now where 11 states have already seceded from the Union, and you're not okay with that, and you're trying to get them back. And now another state is trying to negotiate terms with you for its neutrality. Maybe there's something to be said for responding to that by saying, screw you. That's not how any of this works. You don't dictate terms to us. You're in this union. We have states rebelling. You're damn well going to be on our side to help us put down the rebellion. And if you won't commit to our side explicitly, we're going to treat you like a foreign enemy, like the rest of the Confederacy. Maybe there's something to be said for that approach. I don't know. I'm no diplomat or general. But it's fairly clear to me that Lyon himself didn't make this decision out of any reasoned consideration of national policy toward the rebelling and potentially rebelling states. He was a hothead to begin with. Monahan even calls him a fanatic, and he'd seen his attitudes toward these issues shaped by witnessing the violence of Bleeding Kansas up close. Now, how much of the breakdown of negotiations and the ensuing guerrilla war was actually a direct result of Lyon shooting off his mouth to Jackson? Who knows? But I think it's worth asking the question at least. What if someone more cool-headed had been in Lyon's position? Maybe nothing much changes, but maybe it does, and that's what makes this an interesting what-if moment. Now, Confederate sympathizers in Missouri were already running off to Arkansas to join Confederate armies. That was bound to happen no matter what. But it's important to remember how strong Unionist sentiment was in Missouri. Something like 70% of the population, judging by the results of the 1860 presidential election. What if you have a guy in that negotiation who doesn't go out of his way to antagonize Jackson and the other secessionists? What if he does broker some kind of peaceful neutrality agreement with Missouri, and the federal government backs him up on it, showing its magnanimity and reasonableness, and even respect for states' rights to some extent? That kind of thing might have the potential to harness the existing Unionist sentiment in the state, while also removing the teeth of the secessionists' states' rights argument and bringing the as-yet uncommitted people over to the Unionist side. It's the kind of thing that, if handled skillfully, might just strangle a potential insurgency in the cradle. The thing is, these kinds of guerrilla wars are much easier to stop before they get started. Once they get started, they become exponentially harder to stop because the violence tends to perpetuate itself. We'll keep hammering this point as we go, but as the war progresses, there will end up being untold numbers of Missourians who can say things like, I just wanted to go on farming. I really wasn't that interested in the war at all until Jayhawkers raided my farm, burned my house, and killed my wife and son. And then I became a fanatical secessionist. Or, I really wasn't that interested in the war until bushwhackers raided my family's general store and killed my parents and brother, and I became a fanatical Unionist. How does it change the face of the wider war if there never is a guerrilla war in Missouri? Control of Missouri is not exactly what you'd call the central strategic focus for anyone, but it's not unimportant either. There's rich farmland in the Missouri River Valley, but more importantly, control of Missouri meant control of the upper Mississippi River, which forms Missouri's eastern border. Much of the fighting in the Trans-Mississippi Theater, especially for the first half of the war up through the fall of Vicksburg in July 1863, would revolve around the Union trying to gain control of the Mississippi and the Confederates trying to stop them. I have to think that not having to deal with an insurgency in Missouri would give the Union a huge head start in that department. Now, maybe this doesn't actually change the outcome of the war that much. The Union gained control of the Mississippi in the end anyway. Maybe they get it done faster if they don't have to deal with a Missouri insurgency. If anything, I think it helps the Union, and maybe the war is shortened a little bit. As far as the outcome of the wider war goes, and even American history as a whole, I don't think this what-if scenario holds anywhere near the importance of something like Special Order 191. But I'll tell you who it definitely would have made a huge difference to. Missourians, and Kansans too. Because once the cycle of violence gets started, it takes on a life of its own and becomes a beast that can't be put back on the leash. But whatever the case, Lyon was who he was. The negotiations fell apart, and the fight for Missouri was on. And if you accept the premise that Lyon was at least partially responsible for the outbreak of the Missouri Guerrilla War, we can already see how the history of violence in Bleeding Kansas is impacting the wider Trans-Mississippi War. In some ways, the Missouri Guerrilla War is really just a continuation of Bleeding Kansas. Now faced with the prospect of needing to subdue Missouri by military force, Lyon's first order of business was to take the capital at Jefferson City. In June, he steamed up the Missouri River from St. Louis with 2 regiments of Germans, a company of regulars from his old regiment at Fort Riley, the 2nd Infantry, and 2 more companies of green recruits and a battery of artillery. By the time he got there, the secessionist government under Jackson had already fled the capital and moved about 50 miles upriver to Boonville. Lyon left 3 companies of Germans for police duty in Jefferson City and continued the pursuit with the bulk of his force, about 1,700 men. Interesting that he used the Germans for that, given that he'd just witnessed several days of riots in St. Louis, driven in part by the fact that Missourians resented being policed by foreigners. Jackson scraped together some 1,500 secessionist militia he had on hand under the command of Colonel John Sappington Marmaduke, and on June 17th, Lyon's army advanced on Boonville. Monahan writes in Civil War on the Western Border, quote, Marmaduke urged Clabe Jackson not to pit untrained soldiers against Lyon's regulars, but the governor insisted. With great misgivings, the young commander deployed along the lane at right angles to the advancing column. Lyon spied the thin line of men waiting for his column and deployed his troops parallel to them. From the brick house at the corners, sharpshooters opened fire. Totten, methodical as though at drill, unlimbered his artillery and placed shot after shot through the brick walls. The entire Missouri line gaped at this marksmanship, sensed their own inadequacy, clambered over the fence behind them, and scampered back across the soft fields of waving wheat. Officers swore, threatened, cried shame. The men, soon winded by the uphill run, stopped on the crest. Feeling the confidence of green soldiers on a hilltop, they reformed into a firing line. Marmaduke knew the danger of standing outlined against the sky and ordered the line forward 20 steps. Here the Missourians stopped and opened fire. In the fields below them, Blair's St. Louis volunteers and the regulars came forward with mechanical precision, puffs of white smoke blooming in the fields like cotton bolls. The Missouri volunteers felt helpless before the indomitable advance and melted away. Within 20 minutes, the action was over. Governor Jackson and his cabinet, on horseback, watched the men stream back to their tents. Here another feeble stand was made, until a howitzer on a steamboat enfiladed the encampment, scattering the defenders. Lyon's men swept in and ate the rebels' breakfasts. Vast supplies of shoes, blankets, coats, and carpetbags were captured, and with them 2 Confederate flags. State neutrality, indeed. There was no question about the allegiance of these troops. Newspaper correspondents appropriated 20 saddle horses, laughingly saying that none of the animals was large enough to carry giant Thomas Knox of the New York Herald. The Missourians made a last stand at the fairgrounds. Then the Union column entered Boonville. The district judge, with a small party of leading citizens, stood in the street with a flag of truce. Lyon and Blair assured them that non-combatants would be respected. With this guarantee, the delegation retired, and the soldiers marched smartly down the main street. Many American flags waved at them from the windows. Governor Jackson and his government had evidently fled south where the Union Army could not pursue in steamboats. With furious concentration, Lyon set quartermasters to work assembling wagons for an overland campaign. He also established a patrol of police boats between Kansas City and St. Louis to prevent independent companies like the Rawls County Rangers and the Salt River Tigers from ferrying south to reinforce Jackson. Already, Sweeney should have his division in southwest Missouri, prepared to stop Jackson from escaping to the Confederate Army in Arkansas. Lyon had also wired Major Samuel Sturgis at Fort Leavenworth to march southeast into Missouri. Thus, Jackson would be pinched from 3 sides and surrounded. End quote. The First Battle of Boonville was really more of a skirmish. Casualties were light on both sides, but importantly, the battle established firm Union control over the length of the Missouri River from St. Louis to Kansas City, effectively cutting Missouri in two and confining organized secessionist forces to the southern half of the state. It also highlights an important aspect of this stage of the war, which is just how on the back foot secessionist forces were at this point. You have to remember how chaotic things were in these early days. The Confederacy took time to form. There was no pre-established high-level command structure for the Confederate Army. South Carolina seceded at the tail end of 1860, and 4 months later the war was on. The Confederacy, right off the bat, was scrambling to scrape together a central government and just figure out who all was on their side militarily speaking, let alone come up with some cohesive strategy. Claiborne Jackson was scrambling as desperately as anyone in the Confederacy, probably more so. In places like Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, at least the central government could be pretty certain it knew where the official governments of those states stood, along with the bulk of their populations. Getting organized in those places was really just a matter of incorporating their existing state militias into a larger command structure and concentrating them at the necessary points. But the border states were a completely different story, and Missouri was no different. Missouri, of course, had a state militia and a governor who was at least sympathetic to the secessionist cause, but how much of the state militia would come over to the Confederacy and how much would stay loyal to the Union was anybody's guess. There was a Confederate army concentrating in northern Arkansas, which we'll talk about shortly, but like I said, that would take time. It was time that Jackson really didn't have, and unless he could get some kind of resistance organized in a hurry, the state might just be firmly in the hands of the Union before the Confederacy ever got involved. Lyon's army was already marching south from the Missouri River, soon to be met by Sturgis marching out of Leavenworth in pursuit of Jackson and his government. Sturgis had 2 Kansas regiments with him, and in those units were some familiar faces from the Bleeding Kansas days. Here's Monahan again, quote, "That night of July 7th, 1861, the 2 columns encamped together. The Iowans evaded their guard to visit the newcomers. They found the regulars cut to the familiar pattern, but the 2 Kansas regiments were altogether different. Here were men from the Tallgrass Prairie, with issue blue coats over civilian shirts and trousers. Unmilitary men, often in trouble for robbing hen roosts, yet grim in their hatred of the slave power they had been fighting since 1854. They had seen their meetings spied upon. They had been stopped at night by patrols seeking fugitives. They had had their elections packed and their statute books defaced with laws abridging freedom of speech and the press. They were determined to crush the last vestige of a system which depended on such tactics for survival. Colonel of the 1st Kansas was George Washington Deitzler, from Illinois and California, the crusading abolitionist who had negotiated under Robinson for Sharp's rifles to let the Kansans defend themselves. He had served as aide-de-camp in the Wakarusa War, as senator in the Topeka government, had languished 4 months as a prisoner in Lecompton, and was later elected mayor of Lawrence. He had organized the 1st Kansas, and intended to see them give a good account of themselves. One of his captains was Samuel J. Crawford, originally from Indiana, recently a member of the Kansas legislature until he resigned to accept this commission. He was a fluent speaker and writer, prone to criticize his superiors and praise his inferiors. Good politics, surely. Yet Crawford was a man of action, too. Also in Deitzler's regiment rode Captain Samuel Walker, the Ohioan whose hip disease had not kept him out of Lane's Army of the North, the fight at Fort Saunders, or the siege of Lecompton. He had been scarred for life by buckshot at Fort Titus and looked forward to settling old scores and gaining further military advancement. The 2nd Kansas was commanded by Colonel Robert B. Mitchell, who had brought law books and hollyhock seeds from Ohio to a homestead in Lynn County, Kansas. He had dared oppose both Lane and Montgomery in politics, and had been elected to the legislature in a contest with Charles Hamilton of Merdozine notoriety. One of the captains in his regiment was Samuel N. Wood, who had been prominent in Kansas fracasses since the rescue of Branson. In the ranks stood Charlie Lenhart, one-time printer on the Lawrence Herald of Freedom, the same who had splashed Sheriff Jones by shooting into the water barrel. Charlie had seen his employer's printing press destroyed. He had fought with the partisans at Hickory Point and with Sam Walker at Lecompton. Like so many of his fellow Kansans, he was a veteran long before the Civil War became national. These men remembered Clabe Jackson when he was an ex-legislator leading his Missouri constituents into Lawrence to vote. They wanted to catch him. For them, this was a grudge fight. 25 miles farther down the road from camp at Grand River, the combined column halted before the swollen currents of the Osage. Jackson had crossed before the river rose, but he might be caught yet. The men set to work chopping trees, sawing planks for ferry boats. Couriers rode in from the north with a report that one of Sweeney's regiments, commanded by Franz Sigel, had checked the Missouri governor's army 80 miles below. Could Lyon's men get there in time to help? Lyon also learned that Blair had interceded with Lincoln in his behalf, and a new department had been created for Missouri, with John Charles Fremont, the pathfinder and presidential aspirant of 1856, in command. At last, Lyon's furious energy might accomplish great things in the West. To rush aid to Sigel, he ordered all men to discard non-essentials. Let each company start as soon as it had crossed the river. Hold Clabe Jackson and end the war on the border. If he escaped and joined the Confederate McCulloch in Arkansas, the two might come back together, defeat Lyon's entire army, and retake the state. End quote. Lyon had split his army at St. Louis into two separate commands. One he took on the boats up the Missouri River to Jefferson City and Boonville, and now he was marching south in pursuit of Jackson. The other brigade under Sweeney marched overland out of St. Louis to the southwest. Sweeney marched along the second major campaign axis within the state of Missouri, the first obviously being the Missouri River Valley. It's easy to miss the importance of terrain features to military campaigns if you just look at flat maps of the regions where they take place, but they're very important. And the geography of Missouri is important to this early stage of the war. The most obvious feature is the lush, fertile farmland of the Missouri River Valley. It's known by many as the Missouri Rhineland because geographically it's very similar to the Rhine River Valley in Germany, and we already know Missouri had a large influx of German immigrants in the mid-19th century, and they were reminded of the Rhine Valley when they got there. You can still see the German influence today up and down the Missouri River. But go further south and you get into the Ozark Mountains, and things get much more rugged down there. In any military campaign, it's bound to be important to control the major routes of transportation in the region, which is why the Missouri River is so important. And the other major route in Missouri is roughly along the northern edge of the Ozark Mountains. If you look at a map of Missouri today, it's where Interstate 44 is. It runs southwest out of St. Louis to Springfield and eventually on into Oklahoma to Tulsa. That's the route that Sweeney took to try to cut off Jackson's retreat into Arkansas. Here's Monahan on the beginning of Sweeney's campaign. Quote, "The 2nd Brigade, which Lyon sent southwest to cut off Jackson's retreat, consisted of 5 regiments on paper. 2 of them were St. Louis German Gymnastic Societies, uniformed in gray. Colonel Charles E. Salomon commanded one, and Professor Franz Sigel the other. American volunteers made fun of Sigel, calling him the little red fellow in spectacles, scoffed that he kept looking around like a weasel to see if others were listening when he talked. The expedition was commanded by Captain Thomas W. Sweeney, newly commissioned Brigadier General of Volunteers. Sweeney had emigrated from Ireland to fight in the Mexican War, lost an arm at Churubusco, but remained in the service. Although Sweeney was a regular army man, West Pointers looked on him with condescension because he had risen from the ranks. He had quarreled bitterly with Major Samuel P. Heinzelman when the two were stationed out at Fort Yuma in Arizona. Now Heinzelman was a Brigadier General of Volunteers in Virginia. Sweeney lacked the West Pointers' hauteur toward enlisted men. He even joked familiarly with them in his Irish brogue. Volunteers loved him for this, and because he pinned his empty sleeve on his brass-buttoned breast in the Napoleonic fashion approved for military photographs, then with his stub twitched the sleeve comically. In addition to Sweeney's assignment to cut off Jackson's retreat, he was to hold the southwest Missouri lead mines occupy the country, and discourage an incursion from Arkansas of the Confederates reported to be under colorfully dressed General Benjamin McCulloch, ex-Texas Ranger famous for storming the Obispado in the Mexican War. McCulloch's second in command was James McIntosh, United States officer who had resigned to fight for the Confederacy. End quote. Notice there that the two German regiments were uniformed in gray. These are Union Allied soldiers uniformed in gray. It's another indication of the chaos of these early days. There hasn't been time even for the Union to standardize its uniforms and get everyone supplied with blue army jackets. So many units are just showing up to fight in whatever they have. You'll see the reverse too, by the way, Confederates marching into battle in blue uniforms. That'll famously play a decisive part in the First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, when Union troops mistook the blue-clad 33rd Virginia for other Union troops and didn't fire on them. And that was back east. Out on the frontier, Confederates were lucky to have any uniforms at all, especially at the beginning. And worse, they were sometimes lucky to have weapons. The American military today, and really for maybe 100 years or more, has gotten used to the idea that they have access to a practically infinite supply of weapons and ammunition. It's not actually infinite, obviously, but it might as well be if you're an average soldier, or even a company or field-grade officer. You know that scene in Saving Private Ryan where Captain Miller decides to assault the machine gun nest at that broken-down radar station, and he says they can't just call in an airstrike on it because the Air Force wasn't going to spend ordnance on one machine gun? Yeah, that's nonsense. The Army Air Corps was looking for excuses to spend ordnance. They could and did spend ordnance on literally anything they wanted. I mean, if the U.S. military has a reputation for anything, it's overkill when it comes to firepower. But it wasn't like that in 1861, especially in the Trans-Mississippi, and especially for the Confederates. Today, the idea of sending troops into battle with their own personal weapons that they brought from home sounds ridiculous, but that's exactly what the Confederacy had to do sometimes, especially early on. Sometimes the volunteers would have no weapons of their own, and there were none to give them, so they marched to the front completely unarmed. This is why things like arsenals are so important to control. Governor Jackson wasn't alone in his flight from Boonville. He was joined by thousands of volunteers from that upswell of Confederate sympathy in the wake of the St. Louis riots. And he was on his way to join those forces with Sterling Price and Ben McCulloch in Arkansas. Joining him in this force was the former Senator David Rice Atchison, famous for his role in the Missouri invasions of the Kansas Territorial Poles. Out of about 6,000 men marching with him, something like a third to a half were completely unarmed, to be held in reserve for now and just hoping that after contact with the enemy they'd be able to pick up weapons from the dead and wounded. They'd been fortunate enough to take a local German regiment by surprise while on the march and picked up 600 muskets from them, but a couple thousand were still completely unarmed. Meanwhile, Sweeney established his headquarters at Springfield and sent out detachments to find out where Jackson would try to pass to get to the Arkansas border. On July 5th, a detachment of 1,100 men under Franz Sigel found Jackson north of the little town of Carthage in the southwest corner of the state, and decided to make a stand to hopefully delay him long enough for Lyon's brigade to come up on Jackson's rear from the north. Here's Monahan, quote, "Jackson's army had no uniforms. Officers could be distinguished from the men only by bits of red flannel or a piece of cotton cloth stitched on the arm or shoulder of a homespun jacket or broadcloth frock coat. Jackson parked his 6-pounders down the slope ahead of his line, with Old Sacramento between them. In the center, he raised the flag of Missouri, and on each flank flags of the Confederacy. A questionable presumption, for this was as yet exclusively a state army. The cavalry, 1,000 of them unarmed, were placed at both ends of the nondescript line. Unarmed recruits took position in the rear. The assembled army watched Sigel's column marching toward them, sinuously undulating around obstacles which were invisible at this distance. Jackson's artillery horses and oxen were ordered to the rear, harness chains jingling as they passed through the lines. Then solid shot was rammed down the cannons' mouths, and the artillerymen waited. Already the enemy's advancing column had reached the far side of the timber and was disappearing like a gray snake slithering down a hole. Soon the van emerged from the woods 1,200 yards away. On the open prairie, battalion after battalion deployed in column of companies, a formation to forestall cavalry flanking. The Missouri line admired the precision of the oncoming enemy's movements, but were well convinced now that, counting the unarmed men, they outnumbered the Dutch 3 or 4 to 1. The gray-clad Germans crunched steadily forward across the coarse, dry grass. A command to halt rippled down the ranks, and the formation stopped as though at drill. Sigel rode among the companies, reminding them of their battles in the old country and urging them to prove their mettle now. Then they all moved forward again. When 700 yards from the enemy, Sigel opened fire with grape and canister from his center and from both flanks. Jackson's 6-pounders replied instantly. Both armies stood still, watching the artillery duel. Jackson's solid shot whizzed harmlessly over the heads of Sigel's men, while the Federal grape cut holes in the Missourians' line. Here and there an unmanageable horse reared against the sky or bolted from the field. Then the infantry began to shoot. Smoke billowed from both lines. The bombardment lasted half an hour. Old Sacramento was silenced, and the center line behind it broken. Could it be that the Germans were defeating 4 times their number? Proudly, Sigel turned his telescope toward the enemy's flanks, where he saw something that chilled his military blood. Enemy cavalry were streaming away toward the south from both flanks. Sigel remembered his lumbering wagon train 3 miles in the rear, and he realized that it could easily be cut off. A courier raced back with orders for the teamsters to form a column of 8s and lash ahead. Meanwhile, Sigel drew back into the woods with the same precision that the Missourians had admired in his advance. As the Germans withdrew into the trees, Jackson's men rushed down the slope in pursuit. But at the timber, they discovered that Sigel understood the use of artillery in retreat. His shells exploded where the road entered the woods, and as soon as his army had crossed Coon Creek, projectiles churned the ford behind them. Finally, when the Missourians emerged on the south side, their advance was checked again by shells bursting along the road. In the open country beyond, Sigel placed his 3 batteries 1,000 yards apart. Thus he could cover his retreat with 2 batteries protecting the removal of the hindmost. In this manner, the German regiments crept back across Spring and Bear Creeks, confounding frontier enthusiasts with European military science. Late in the afternoon, Sigel noted that the road ahead passed through a cut between 2 hills. Many of the enemy's cavalry, largely unarmed, stood above the road, evidently planning to pounce on the solid column as it trundled through with the heavy wagons. Here was a sunken road, a name notorious to all students of Napoleonic history. Sigel, the military tactician, decided to show the frontiersmen a new trick. He divided his column, each half marching forward obliquely. When the enemy was between his pincers, Sigel opened fire. To save themselves, the horsemen retreated down into the sunken road, out of range, and formed to charge Sigel's weakened center, a maneuver Sigel had anticipated. The ragged horseman had hardly got in position when his German flankers gained the heights and began shooting down into the cut as Sigel swept it with well-aimed charges of grape fired along the road. 85 riderless horses raced out to be captured by footsore and near-exhausted Union infantrymen who had been almost ready to drop by the roadside. At dusk, Sigel's tightly knit regiments trooped through Carthage, still deserted. Behind him, Jackson's men swarmed across the meadows, firing from lanes and fences. Sigel wheeled east on the Mount Vernon road to Springfield, where Lyon should soon arrive from the north. Shortly after dark, Sigel's men entered the woods east of Carthage, and the enemy abandoned the chase in the gloom of dense foliage. The tired Germans marched on for 12.5 miles to Sarcoxy, arriving at 3 a.m. They had stopped here on the way down. Now they built fires on the old campground, cooked the first food they had eaten for 24 hours, and dozed against trees and in fence corners. Many lay on their backs, holding up swollen feet for the blood to run back into their bodies. At dawn, sergeants aroused the weary men, prodding them with guttural German oaths. Sleepy soldiers lined up, answered roll call, and trudged forward into the blinding rays of the rising sun and another stifling July day. By mid-morning, 18 miles along the road, the column filed through Mount Vernon. Sigel was sure now that no enemy followed. He ordered a day's rest. Sibley tents were pitched. Men washed themselves in their shirts, sitting around naked until their laundry dried. The 35 additional miles to Springfield were covered leisurely, and when the column marched in, Sigel reported to Lyon, recently arrived, the details of his masterly retreat. 13 killed and 31 wounded. He had saved his army but lost the lead mines. Germans across the nation lauded his successful military maneuver, and as far away as San Francisco, his compatriots prepared a gorgeous flag in recognition of his military skill. Clabe Jackson's state troops, when they gave up the chase at the edge of the dark woods, returned to Carthage, stacked arms in the street, and boasted about their victory to all citizens who dared venture back to town. Next day, as Sigel rested at Mount Vernon, Governor Jackson marched triumphantly south, beside him the bluff figure of Senator Atchison, talking, perhaps, about great times in Kansas. Lieutenant Governor Reynolds was unaccustomed to the hardships. Military campaigning disagreed with his plump physique and orderly mind. No facilities for filing documents with the precision that delighted him. No opportunity to display his florid literary style and elaborately schooled chirography. However, that difficulty might be corrected now by an about-face and the recapture of Jefferson City. Price's and McCulloch's army, combined, would be more than a match for all of Lyon's men. End quote. Sigel's retreat might have been precise and well executed, but it left the road open for Jackson to continue south and join up with Price and McCulloch, which he quickly did. With Jackson's government now effectively in exile in Arkansas, there was no chance of Missouri coming over to the Confederacy in any official capacity unless it could be retaken by the Confederate Army. And to that end, Price and McCulloch went into action. The recruits that came with Jackson were largely veterans already. They'd either fought Indians on the frontier or been involved in the Kansas conflict, so they were no strangers to combat, but what they were in sore need of, as shown in the Battle of Carthage, was proper training and equipment. Price did the best he could with the training, but there wasn't a lot of time. And there wasn't a lot of time to get proper weapons either. While Price and McCulloch were organizing, John C. Fremont, the new department commander in Missouri and Lyon's direct superior, was at his headquarters in St. Louis forming his plans for the Trans-Mississippi campaign. In some ways, he was prescient as to how the war in the far west would play out. He correctly saw that the Mississippi River was the key to all of it, and that the Confederacy would wither on the vine if supply up and down the Mississippi was choked off. He formed his plans for controlling Missouri with that ultimate goal in mind, and unfortunately for Lyon, his position in the southwest corner of the state was too far from the Mississippi and too overextended to play any major role in Fremont's grand plans. His army was worn out from marching, not very well equipped, low on ammo, and had stretched out supply lines going back to St. Louis that were constantly under threat from partisans. To make matters worse, the Confederate government had recognized the importance of Missouri and detached a force of 6,000 from Brigadier General Gideon Pillow to land in the far southeast corner of the state at New Madrid and help in harassing Lyon's supply lines. By the 1st of August, Price and McCulloch were on the march as Lyon advanced out of Springfield. Lyon made contact and estimated their strength at up to 20,000 against his own 6,000. That did turn out to be an overestimate, but even so, he retreated back to Springfield, fighting a couple of rearguard skirmishes on the way at Doug Springs on August 2nd and Curran's Post Office on August 3rd. He got word from Fremont back in St. Louis that he was on his own. There would be no reinforcements because Fremont had other plans. Then later, on August 3rd, news arrived of the war's first real major battle at a place called Bull Run back in Virginia. Whether the significance of that battle was fully understood out west, it was an ugly, bloody nose for the Union. See, at the outbreak of war, the United States suffered from the same naive optimism that has plagued the public minds of many a nation entering into many a long, bloody war. Very few people on the Union side appreciated what the Confederacy was capable of. The thinking was that they would win a quick victory in Virginia, march on to Richmond, depose the Confederate government, and the whole thing would be over in a few months. Well, that is not the way it worked out. On July 21st, in a chaotic, messy clash of tens of thousands of poorly organized and minimally trained men, The Union Army under Irvin McDowell was broken and routed by Confederates under Joseph E. Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard. Even though it was by far the largest and bloodiest battle in American history up to that point, it would pale in comparison to later battles of this war. Stonewall Jackson earned his nickname at this first Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas as it came to be called in the South after the nearby Manassas Junction. By the end of the battle, the Union Army was utterly shattered and resistance completely collapsed. The government panicked, thinking that instead of the Union Army taking Richmond, the Confederate Army would now take Washington. With some 14,000 fresh troops who'd not even been engaged in the battle and next to nothing standing between them and the U.S. Capitol, Johnston had a more than adequate force to march in and take Washington right then. But in another one of those big what-ifs of history, he didn't. Some in the Confederacy felt that the war had just been won with this victory. They'd shown themselves willing and able to resist Union force, and that it would be no easy job to bring them back into the Union. There was also an optics aspect to this. The Confederacy wanted the outside world to see that they weren't the aggressors here. They would defend their own land, but had no interest in trying to conquer Union territory. Whatever the reason, there was no advance on Washington, but the Union's naive optimism about what it would take to win this war evaporated almost overnight. Whatever Lyon's appreciation of this news was, it must have contributed to his decision to do what he did next. He didn't want to give up southwest Missouri without a fight, whatever Fremont's plans were. Worse, he was already dealing with expiring enlistments among his men, and was sure that many of them wouldn't stay unless there was a battle soon. When the men found out about the defeat at Bull Run, they were eager to reclaim the nation's honor they thought had been lost by those cowards back east. With all that in mind, Lyon decided to march out and attack the Confederate army that outnumbered him almost 2-1. However sorry a state Lyon's army was in, things weren't much better for the Confederates. Shelby Foote explains in the first volume of his Civil War trilogy, quote, "They were not as formidable as Lyon thought, and for several reasons. Though they numbered almost 12,000, twice the size of the Union force, for the most part they were miserably equipped and poorly organized, under commanders who were divided in their counsels and ambitions. The majority were Missouri militia led by Sterling Price, a 52-year-old Virginia-born ex-governor who thought so little of West Pointers that he inserted a notice in the papers, indignantly quashing a rumor that he had received a formal military education. His men had neither uniforms nor tents. Many had no arms at all, while others had only shotguns or 1812-style flintlocks, and as substitutes for artillery projectiles they had laid in a stock of smooth stones, rusty chains, and iron rods to be shot from their 8 antiquated cannon. The remainder, under Ben McCulloch of Tennessee, 40 years old and a former Texas Ranger, were somewhat better equipped, being regular Confederate troops. Price was a major general, McCulloch a brigadier, both veterans of the Mexican War, but the latter, who held his commission directly from Richmond, did not feel that the former should outrank him, and refused to combine the two forces unless the Missourian would yield command. Price, called Old Pat by his men, they asserted that their general had won more battles in Mexico than McCulloch ever witnessed, was so anxious to fall upon Lyon that he agreed to the stipulation. As soon as Lyon began his retreat, McCulloch led the combined forces after him. They went into camp along Wilson's Creek, 10 miles short of Springfield, where the Federals had halted. McCulloch drew up plans for attack. The movement began on August 9th, but was called off because of threatening rain. The troops returned to camp and settled down to sleep, not bothering to put out pickets. At dawn, the storm of Lyon's attack exploded in their rear." End quote. Lyon's attack plan was for a surprise dawn envelopment of the Confederates in camp. The Confederates were encamped along Wilson's Creek, about 10 miles southwest of Springfield, near where the wire road down to Cowskin Prairie in Arkansas intersected the creek. The plan was what Shelby Foote calls, quote, one of those complicated envelopments so popular in the early days of the war, when the generals and the soldiers they commanded were least capable of executing them." End quote. But if anyone was capable at this point of executing this maneuver, it was Sigel and his well-drilled Germans. The plan called for him to circle around the camp and attack at dawn from the southeast with 1,200 men, while Lyon and the main force would strike from the northwest. This was an insanely risky thing to do. Not only was Lyon splitting his forces in the presence of the enemy, he was doing it in the presence of an enemy that outnumbered him 2-1. And in these days, there was no radio communication, which meant that once the two columns were separated, there would be no way to coordinate them or have them support each other. The plan depended almost completely on speed, surprise, and envelopment to break the cohesion of the numerically superior Confederates. Despite the complexity of the plan and the coordination required, Sigel was right on time at dawn on August 10th, and it was his attack that exploded in the Confederate rear. Surprise was achieved completely. Monahan writes, quote, "General Ben McCulloch was at Price's tent when the alarm sounded. The venerable white-haired politician sat with his adjutant, Thomas Sneed, who still cherished the memory of Lyon's defiance in St. Louis. McCulloch had ordered pickets drawn in last night for his proposed march to Springfield, but when the rain began at 9 p.m., the storm reached Lyon at midnight, he canceled orders for the advance. Someone blundered by forgetting to replace sentries. Neither McCulloch nor Price suspected that Lyon was near. A cavalry detail from Raines's division had been out on the prairie all night between the roads Sigel and Lyon traveled, but did not see or hear them. Eager to get back at dawn for hot coffee, they stopped only to forage a few bushels of corn which they were carrying on their saddles when they spied the enemy. Long lines of men marching down upon them as far as they could see. The horsemen threw away their burdens and spurred to camp. Colonel John F. Snyder heard their breathless report and galloped down to Price's tent where the two commanders sat in conference. "Lyon," he shouted, "with 20,000 men and 100 pieces of artillery, is within a mile of this army." McCulloch had had his fill of panicky Missourians stampeded at Doug Springs, and he believed this another of Raines's scares. But soon he heard shouts, then the fusillade. Looking up Wilson's Creek, he saw a mob of men on horseback and in wagons whipping down the valley. Then Totten's cannon shell screamed across Wilson's Creek. Almost at once another cannon, Sigel's, answered from the other side of the camp. Evidently the enemy was attacking on both sides. The surprise was complete. One of Price's regimental officers was eating breakfast when an orderly galloped up, yelling for him to form his men. "Is that official?" the officer queried as he sipped his coffee. The next moment, a shell from Totten's battery cut a sapling near the table. "Well, by God," he cried, "that is official." And he ordered out his men. McCulloch's army, if army it could be called, stood dumbfounded, brave but confused. Lewis Hebert's neatly clad 3rd Louisiana, the Pelican Rifles, held their formation. So did the Texans, proudly distinguished from the rabble by white muslin around their left arms. Pierce's newly mustered Arkansans were half-drilled and only partly armed. Some carried their own shotguns, but no cartridge boxes or other equipment. Price's men had learned to hold rough formations at Cowskin Prairie, but fully 1,000 of them still had no guns or tents. At night they bivouacked in the brush, and by day foraged on the prairies or loitered around the beef herd for their allotment of meat on the hoof. McCulloch still held these Missourians in low esteem and counted on his other troops to win the battle. Perhaps this was an error in judgment, for the Missouri horde in coarse cotton shirts and yellow jean pantaloons were veterans, and, like the Kansans on the other side, they looked forward to settling old scores in this fight. Some of them had been members of the bogus Kansas legislature. Others had been captured and paroled from Camp Jackson in St. Louis. Men like Joe Shelby, William Quantrill, Frank James, and Cole Younger, and they were legion, could be counted on to fight with courage and resourcefulness. End quote. The Confederates on the south side of camp panicked and ran when Sigel started his advance, but Sigel's Germans became just as disorganized in their momentary victory. They overran the southernmost parts of the camp and started looting, but were taken off guard and shattered when an Arkansas regiment reformed and counterattacked. Meanwhile, the other half of Sigel's column continued marching clockwise around the camp further to the south until they were spotted by McCulloch, who ordered Hebert's Louisianans to attack them. Sigel saw them coming, but in the fog of war mistook them for the friendly 1st Iowa Regiment and had his men hold their fire, which spelled disaster when the Louisianans opened up on him at point-blank range. And that was the end for Sigel in this battle. His entire column shattered. The survivors, including Sigel himself, fled for their lives all the way back to Springfield. Of course, with no communications between Lyon's column and Sigel's, Lyon had no idea what had happened to Sigel until an artilleryman realized that he was taking incoming fire from Sigel's own guns, now captured and turned against Lyon's column. Lyon had also attacked at dawn and initially pushed the Confederates back, but as the advance went forward, Hebert's Louisianans were seen setting up in a broomcorn field across the creek to the east, in perfect position to enfilade Lyon's left flank as he advanced. So he called a temporary halt to send some forces across the creek to deal with them, which caused a critical delay in the advance and gave the Confederates time to reform. The action in the broomcorn field was almost a separate battle all on its own. It was back and forth for the first part of the morning. McCulloch sent in more units over there to support the 3rd Louisiana. In the end, the Confederates repulsed all the attacks that came against them, but the forces in that part of the field were at least occupied enough to where they couldn't fire on Lyon's left flank as he advanced, and the main attack went forward. As soon as the 3rd Louisiana was done there, they shifted to the south to strike their decisive blow against Sigel's column. Everything was chaos in the main assault. Monahan writes, quote, "Clouds of smoke obscured the movements on both sides. Soldiers coughed in the ghastly white light, stumbled over the brush. In the turmoil, some companies advanced too far, others not far enough. Company E of the 1st Kansas inadvertently dressed on the Missouri enemy and fought with it, perplexed by seeing their supposed comrades shooting in the wrong direction. Finally, a Kansan recognized a rebel captain as the ex-postmaster at Leavenworth, a hated border ruffian, and shot him dead. Colonel Deitzler of the 1st Kansas was carried from the smoke, a buckshot in his thigh. In some companies, almost half the men fell." End quote. One of the men who fell was Lyon himself. He was grazed on the head by a bullet, hit once in the thigh and once in the ankle, had his horse shot from under him, and was carried to the rear dazed. It must have been around that time that he realized Sigel was gone and the Confederates were free to concentrate their now 3-1 numerical advantage fully on his column. The fighting was furious and every bit as chaotic as you'd expect it to be with so many untrained men going at each other. It set the tone for what the war would be like out west. This is how Shelby Foote describes it. Quote, "Few of the romantic preconceptions as to brilliant maneuver and individual gallantry were realized. Fighting at close quarters because of the short-range Confederate flintlocks and muzzle-loading fowling pieces, a regiment would walk up to the firing line, deliver a volley, then reload and deliver another, continuing this until it dissolved and was replaced by another regiment, which repeated the process, melting away in the heat of the furnace and being in turn replaced. No fighting anywhere ever required greater courage, yet individual gallantry seemed strangely out of place. A plume in a man's hat, for example, accomplished nothing except to make him a more conspicuous target. Nor did the rebel yell ring out on the banks of Wilson's Creek. There was little cheering on either side, for a cheer seemed as oddly out of place as a plume. The men went about their deadly business of firing and reloading and melting away in a grim silence broken only by the rattling crash of musketry and the deeper roar of guns, with the screams of the injured sometimes piercing the din. Far from resembling panoplied war, it was more like reciprocal murder." End quote. As Lyon contemplated retreat, the Confederates counterattacked uphill all along the line. Lyon had to throw in his reserves to repulse them and decided against retreat. He found another horse, rode back into the fray and was killed by a bullet through the heart. That left Major Sturgis in overall command, and after repulsing a second Confederate counterattack, he decided the men couldn't take a third. They were tired from their night march, low on ammunition, and fighting on empty stomachs because they hadn't eaten since the night before. Sturgis ordered the retreat. Foote continues, quote, "It was Manassas all over again. Once the Federal troops gave way, they did not stand upon the order of their going, but retreated pell-mell to Springfield and then to Rolla, leaving their fallen comrades on the field. Kansas, Missouri, and Iowa farm boys lying dead in their new shoes, and the brave Lyon, whose body McCulloch forwarded through the lines under a flag of truce, only to recapture it when the Unionists fell back from Springfield, abandoning it in its coffin in the courthouse. The fighting had been bloody. The severest battle since Waterloo, one participant called it. Within 4 hours, each side had suffered about 1,200 casualties. In 1/3 the time, and with less than 1/3 the number of troops involved, more than half as many men had fallen along Wilson's Creek as had fallen along Bull Run. Yet here, too, as after that battle 3 weeks before, on the banks of that other rural stream 800 miles away, one side was about as disorganized by victory as the other was by defeat. Though there was broad open daylight for pursuit, the Confederates could not be put into column to press the retreating Federals. All the same, the battle was taken as further proof, if such was needed, of the obvious superiority of the Southern fighting man, and in Missouri, as in Virginia, there was the feeling that, now that the Yankees had been shown what they were up against, there was no real need for giving chase." End quote. Wilson's Creek became known as the Bull Run of the West. It was another ugly, bloody nose for the Union, coming hard on the heels of the one back east. If the country didn't understand before that this was about to be a much longer and harder fought war than they'd initially thought, they sure understood now. Though the armies engaged were smaller than those at Bull Run, the losses, taken as a percentage, were staggering. 1,317 Union and 1,230 Confederates became casualties, for a total of 23% across both sides, the highest casualty percentage of any battle of the Civil War. That number for Bull Run was less than 10%. Some units suffered much worse than the average. Company E of the 1st Kansas, which had the mix-up with the Missouri Regiment, lost 2/3 of their number, going in with 76 men and coming out with only 26. Company F of the 2nd Kansas went in with 64 and came out with 24. Out of the total casualties, over 500 were killed in action. The battle forced Fremont back in St. Louis to refocus. Before he could execute this grand plan of controlling the Mississippi, he'd have to deal with McCulloch's army first and solidify his control of Missouri. The war was over for Lyon, for the more than 500 other dead men, and for who knows how many of the wounded who were permanently maimed. But for the living, the war was just getting started. on the next episode of American Guerrillas. The Kansas Jayhawkers raise the black flag and start slitting throats. Very literally. We dive into the nitty-gritty of what's going on in the war zone of Missouri, under the surface, away from the spotlight of these marching armies and great battles. And it will be ugly. In the meantime, subscribe to the Substack, link in the show notes. $5 a month or $50 a year. Share this show with a friend if you like it. If you have questions or comments, send me an email at unsung.substack@gmail.com. I've been thinking of doing some kind of Q&A towards the end of this series. Depends if I get any good questions or comments, so send them in if you'd like to hear that. As always, thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for the next one, that the deeds of men shall not go unsung.